They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when your own family serves you like trash at the most important day of their lives? Picture this: a wedding hall dripping with champagne and crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, a 5-course meal fit for royalty, and me, I got a bowl of cereal. She's just the adopted one. My brother laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. Give her cereal, it's enough. The entire table erupted. 200 guests, 200 people watching me sit there holding a plastic spoon while they carved into filet mignon. I could have cried. I could have run. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone, smiled, and made one call that would destroy them. Cancel the $300 million deal with Powell Industries. Effective immediately. The laughter died. The room went silent. And by sunrise, their empire began to crumble. But that was just the beginning. Because what they didn't... No, I wasn't just the adopted daughter. I was the secret they buried, the truth they feared, and the reckoning they never saw coming. Stay with me, because this story ends with more than revenge. It ends with justice secrets and a twist they'll never forget. My name is Christina Hart. I'm 34 years old, the Chief Financial Officer and 30% shareholder of Sterling Financial Group, one of the most respected investment firms on the East Coast. On paper, I have everything most people dream of: power, wealth, independence. But every morning when I wake up in my penthouse overlooking the city, I'm reminded that success and happiness aren't the same thing. This particular Monday morning started like all the others. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, running a brush through my hair, studying the woman staring back at me. Designer suit hanging perfectly on my frame, flawless makeup masking the exhaustion beneath. A carefully constructed image of control and competence. But behind those eyes, I saw something else entirely, a profound aching loneliness that no amount of money or professional achievement could fill. The penthouse around me was a testament to everything I'd built. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian marble, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Yet it felt more like a museum than a home. No family photos on the walls, no warmth, just cold perfection, exactly like the life I'd constructed for myself. I walked to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and that's when I saw a cream-coloured envelope sitting on my marble countertop where my assistant must have left it the day before. I recognised the embossed return address immediately. Powell. My chest tightened. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation, elegant calligraphy on heavy cardstock, announcing the marriage of Daniel Richard Powell to someone named Vanessa Clark. The wedding was in 2 weeks. But what caught my attention, what made my stomach drop, was how it was addressed. To guest. Not to Christina, not even to Miss Hart, just to guest. Like I was some random acquaintance they felt obligated to invite. Mass-printed, impersonal. Exactly the kind of thoughtless gesture I should have expected from the Powell family, yet somehow it still managed to wound me. I set the invitation down and closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, standing awkwardly at the edge of the Powell family Christmas photo. I remembered the photographer saying, "Little girl, can you move a bit to the left?" And I did, moving further and further until I was barely in the frame at all. That photo hung in their hallway for years, Miss and Mrs. Powell, in the centre, Daniel front and centre, like a little prince and me, a blurry figure at the very edge so far removed, I was almost cropped out entirely. It wasn't just that photo either. Birthday parties where Daniel got lavish gifts and I got practical necessities. Family vacations where they'd book a beautiful suite for the 3 of them, and a small, separate room for me, always down the hall, always apart. Thanksgiving dinners where I'd help in the kitchen while Daniel sat with the adults. 1,000 small moments that reminded me I wasn't really family. I was something else, something less. The Powells had taken me in when I was 6 after my mother died. They gave me a roof over my head, food on the table, an expensive education. I should have been grateful. Mrs. Powell reminded me of that often enough. You're so lucky we took you in, Christina. Don't ever forget that. And I never did forget. Not for a single day. I looked at the invitation again, at those 2 words that summarized 30 years of my life with them, to guest. I wondered if they even remembered I existed beyond being an obligation, a box to check a gesture of charity they could pat themselves on the back for. Of course they remembered me. How could they forget their living, breathing proof of charitable generosity? The Powells never let anyone forget what they'd done for poor little orphaned Christina. Richard Powell was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. Tall, silver-haired, even in his 40s, with a voice that could silence a boardroom with a single word. He'd built Powell Industries from a small manufacturing company into a diversified empire worth hundreds of millions. Business magazines featured him regularly. Politicians sought his endorsement. He was powerful, respected, untouchable, and completely absent from my childhood. Oh, he was physically present, sitting at the head of the dinner table, reading his newspaper in the study, hosting business associates in the living room. But he never really saw me. When he looked in my direction, his eyes would slide past me as if I were part of the furniture. On the rare occasions he addressed me directly, it was always with the same distant politeness he'd use with a household staff member. Christina, please pass the salt. Christina, keep your voice down, I'm on an important call. Never a question about my day, my interests, my life. I was a responsibility he'd agreed to take on, nothing more. Elaine Powell was different. She saw me very clearly, and that was somehow worse. Mrs. Powell, as I was instructed to call her until I turned 18, was the embodiment of old money elegance. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never seemed to move. Designer clothes that probably cost more than my college tuition. She chaired charity galas, sat on museum boards, hosted fundraisers for causes she cared about that week. She knew exactly how to smile for the cameras, how to say all the right things about compassion and giving back. Behind closed doors, her compassion had limits. Very specific limits that ended precisely at the boundary of genuine maternal affection. She monitored everything I did with the critical eye of someone inspecting a purchase she was starting to regret. My posture at the dinner table, the way I spoke, how I dressed, whether I was appropriately grateful. Sit up straight, Christina. Don't mumble, Christina. That dress is too casual for Sunday service. Go change. Every interaction was a test I never quite passed. But Daniel was the stone around which the entire Powell household revolved. He was 2 years younger than me, and from the moment I arrived at their home, he made it clear that I was invading his territory. At first, it was small things, hiding my toys, telling his parents I'd broken something he'd actually broken himself, excluding me from games with his friends. As we got older, his cruelty evolved, became more sophisticated, more calculated. The birthday incident happened when Daniel turned 12. I was 14, old enough to understand that handmade gifts probably weren't cool, but too poor to buy anything store-bought that would impress him. I'd spent weeks working on a leather bookmark, carefully tooling his initials into it, treating and conditioning the leather until it was soft and perfect. I'd even included a quote I thought he'd like, something about courage and adventure, from one of the books I'd seen on his shelf. I gave it to him at his birthday party in front of all his friends and both his parents. The living room was full of people, expensive presents piled high on the table, video games, designer clothes, the latest tech gadgets. My little wrapped bookmark looked pathetic next to all of that, but I'd hoped the personal touch would matter. Daniel opened it, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then let it drop to the floor like it was contaminated. "What is this?" "What?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you make this?" I nodded, my face already burning with humiliation. "Why would I want something you made?" He kicked it aside with his foot and his friends laughed. "Mum, why is she even giving me presents? She doesn't have any money. This is embarrassing." I looked at Mrs. Powell desperately, hoping she'd defend me, tell Daniel he was being rude, that it was the thought that counted. Instead, she gave me that tight smile I knew so well. "Christina, dear, perhaps next time you should ask before making gifts. Daniel has very specific tastes." Then she turned to her son. "Come on, sweetheart, open your real presents." The room erupted in laughter, not cruel, malicious laughter that might have been easier to bear. No, it was casual, dismissive laughter, the kind that said my hurt feelings weren't even important enough to be intentional. I was just a joke they'd already moved past. I learned something crucial that day. I learned that in the Powell household, love and acceptance weren't things you could earn through effort or kindness or trying your best. They were reserved for people who belonged, and I would never belong. So I adapted. I became quiet, obedient. I learned to anticipate their needs before they asked. I kept my room spotless, my grades perfect, my presence as unobtrusive as possible. I volunteered to help with chores, stayed out of Daniel's way, never complained, never asked for anything I didn't absolutely need. I made myself useful enough to keep invisible enough to ignore. It worked in a way. The active cruelty lessened. I was allowed to stay. But the coldness never thawed and the distance never closed. Mrs. Issuers. Powell's words became my daily mantra, repeated so often I could hear them in my sleep. Usually, she'd say them when I'd failed to be sufficiently grateful for something, a new winter coat, when my old one wore out permission to attend a school function, a ride to a friend's house. "You're lucky we took you in, Christina. Don't ever forget that." And I never, ever did. And I hadn't forgotten. Those words had fueled every late night, studying for my MBA, every grueling hour, building my career, every decision that led me to where I stood now, financially independent, professionally respected, completely untethered from needing anything the Powells could offer. Yet here I was, staring at that invitation, and part of me, the small, hopeful part I'd never quite managed to kill, wondered if this might be different. A wedding was family business. Maybe they wanted me there, not out of obligation, but because after all these years, they'd finally realised I was one of them. I knew better. I really did, but hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and tried to focus on my day. I had meetings scheduled, quarterly reports, to review a conference call with our London office. My life had moved far beyond the Powell family drama, or at least that's what I told myself. The universe apparently had other plans. I was barely through my first coffee when my phone rang. Michael Chen, my business partner and the other CFO at Sterling Financial Group. We'd built this company together over the past 8 years, starting as ambitious junior analysts at a larger firm and eventually breaking off to create something of our own. If anyone understood the cutthroat nature of high finance, it was Michael. "Christina, good morning," he said, his voice carrying that edge of excitement he got when a major deal was coming together. "I hope you're sitting down. I just got off the phone with our legal team." "Good news, I hope." "The best. You remember that manufacturing contract we've been negotiating for the past 6 months, the potential partnership with that diversified industrial company?" I did remember. It was massive, a $300 million financing deal that would not only bring Sterling substantial fees, but also cement our reputation as a major player in corporate finance. Of course. What's the status? They're ready to sign. Their board approved it last night. We're looking at finalising everything in 2 weeks. Saturday the 18th, to be specific. They want to do the signing at their headquarters, make it a big event. Press coverage, the whole 9 yards. Saturday the 18th. I looked at the wedding invitation sitting on my counter, the date printed in elegant script. Saturday, June 18th. My stomach sank. "Christina, you still there?" "Yes, sorry. That's incredible news, Michael. Really incredible." I forced enthusiasm into my voice. Who's the company you've been keeping that detail close to the vest? There was a pause on the other end just long enough to make my chest tighten. Powell Industries. Christina, it's Richard Powell's company. I know you have history there, but this is purely business. This deal could transform Sterling's entire trajectory. Of course it was. Of course the universe would arrange things this way. I didn't realise we were negotiating with Powell Industries, I said carefully. That information wasn't in the preliminary briefs. They requested confidentiality during negotiations, standard practice for a company their size. But now that it's approved, I wanted you to know before the formal announcement. Michael hesitated. Is this going to be a problem? I know you were adopted by the family, but that was a long time ago. This is just business. Just business. As if anything involving the Powells had ever been simple for me. It's fine, I heard myself say. Completely fine. Saturday, the 18th, works for the signing. Except it didn't work. Daniel's wedding was Saturday the 18th. The same day. The exact same day. After I hung up with Michael, I sat in my pristine kitchen, surrounded by all the trappings of success I'd accumulated, and faced an impossible choice. On one hand, the biggest business deal of my career, a transaction I'd helped structure and negotiate for half a year. A deal that would prove once and for all that Christina Hart was a force in the financial world, someone who commanded respect and wielded real power. On the other hand, my brother's wedding, my family, or what passed for family in my complicated life. The logical choice was obvious. Business over a wedding where I was barely wanted, where my invitation had been addressed to guest, where I'd probably spend the entire event feeling like an outsider anyway. Michael and the Sterling team needed me at that signing. This was what I'd worked for my entire adult life. But as I turned the invitation over in my hands, I heard Mrs. Powell's voice in my head, not the cruel words from my childhood, but something she'd said more recently at a chance encounter at a charity gala 2 years ago. Family is everything, Christina. I hope whatever success you found hasn't made you forget that. At the time, I thought it was a typical Elaine Powell barb, a subtle reminder that I'd never quite measure up to their standards of what family meant. But now, staring at this invitation, I wondered if it was something else. A test, perhaps, or maybe possibly an actual invitation to finally be part of something I'd wanted my whole life. I picked up my phone and called Michael back. I need to postpone the signing, I said. Move it to the following Monday. Tell Powell Industries it's a scheduling conflict on our end, something unavoidable. Christina, are you sure they specifically requested Saturday? It might complicate things. I'm sure. Make it work, Michael. That's what we do. After I hung up, I looked at the invitation one more time. Good daughters show up for their brother's wedding. Good daughters put family first. Maybe if I did this, if I showed up and smiled and played my part perfectly, they'd finally see me as more than an obligation they'd discharged decades ago. Maybe this time they'd finally see me as family. That hope had sustained me through 2 weeks of preparation. But now standing in my penthouse on Friday evening, with my suitcase half packed and my doubts fully present, I wasn't so sure anymore. The intercom buzzed. Michael. I'd given him the code to my building years ago, back when we'd worked so many late nights that it made sense for him to come and go freely. He was more than a business partner. Over the years, he'd become the closest thing I had to family, which said something either very good about him or very sad about me. You're really going through with this? He said when I opened the door. It wasn't a question. He was holding 2 containers of Thai food from the place near his apartment, the same order we always got when one of us needed to talk through something difficult. The wedding is tomorrow at 3, I said, taking one of the containers. I've already RSVP'd. I postponed a $300 million deal. Yes, I'm going through with it. Michael set his food on my kitchen counter and looked at me with that expression I'd come to recognize over the years. concern mixed with frustration, the look of someone who cared about you enough to tell you truths you didn't want to hear. "Christina, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear me." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a nervous habit he had when he was choosing his words carefully. "Don't go. These people, they've hurt you before. They're going to hurt you again." "You don't know that?" "Yes, I do. And so do you." He moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I've watched you build yourself into this incredible force in business. You're brilliant, you're powerful, you command respect everywhere you go. But every time the Powell name comes up, every time you have any contact with that family, I see you shrink. You become that little girl again, the one desperate for approval from people who don't deserve you." His words landed like physical blows because they were true. I'd spent years constructing armor around myself, building a life where I controlled everything, where no one could make me feel small or unwanted. But the Powells had a way of dismantling all of that with a single gesture, a single thoughtless invitation addressed to guest. "They're my family," I said weakly. "Are they? Family doesn't treat you like an afterthought. Family doesn't send you mass-printed invitations. Family doesn't make you feel like you have to earn the basic dignity of being remembered." Michael's voice cracked slightly. "You're my family, Christina. The team at Sterling, the people who actually know you and value you. We're your family. These people who share your last name, they're just strangers who happened to provide you with a roof 25 years ago." I turned away from him, looking out my floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. "You don't understand what it's like. Then, help me understand." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. "I have this dream. I've had it since I was a child, and it still comes back sometimes. I'm standing outside the Powell house at night in the cold, looking through the dining room window. They're all inside having dinner, Mr. Powell at the head of the table, Mrs. Powell smiling, Daniel laughing at something his father said. The table is full of food, and they're warm and happy, and they're a family. And I'm outside in the dark, pressing my hands against the glass, trying to get in. I knock and knock, but they don't hear me. Or they do hear me, and they choose not to let me in. I can never tell which is worse." When I turned back to Michael, his eyes were glistening. "In the dream, I'm always cold," I continued, "freezing, and I can see the warmth inside. I can almost feel it through the glass. But there's this invisible barrier I can't cross. I wake up and my face is wet from crying, and for a few seconds I can't remember if I'm 34 or 8 years old." Michael stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. I stood stiffly at first, then let myself lean into him, accepting comfort I rarely allowed myself to receive. "You don't owe them anything," he said quietly into my hair. "You don't have to prove you're enough, Christina. You've always been enough. They're the ones who failed, not you." I pulled back, wiping at my eyes. Maybe I need to prove it to myself. Maybe I need to walk into that wedding with my head high, successful and independent, and show them that the little girl they dismissed became someone they should have valued. Maybe I need to close that chapter properly. And if they hurt you again, then I'll know I tried. I'll know I gave them every chance. And maybe then I can finally stop having that dream. Michael studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but I want you to promise me something. The second you feel yourself shrinking, the second they make you feel like you're not enough, you leave. You don't owe them your dignity. You don't owe them your self-worth." "I promise," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I could keep it. After Michael left, I returned to my bedroom and opened my closet. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, something elegant but understated. But now, looking at my options, I pulled out something different. A simple white dress, classic and beautiful, the kind of thing you'd wear to a garden party or an afternoon wedding. I held it up to myself in the mirror. White. The colour of innocence, of new beginnings of brides. But I wasn't the bride. I was just a woman in a white dress arriving alone at her brother's wedding, hoping against all evidence and experience that today would be the day everything changed. The venue was exactly what I'd expected, from the Powells, opulent to the point of excess. The Grandview estate sat on 20 acres of manicured gardens, all rolling lawns and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The main hall was a masterpiece of old-world elegance, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the polished floors. I handed my keys to the valet, a young man in a crisp uniform who didn't make eye contact and walked toward the entrance. White roses were everywhere, climbing up archways cascading from enormous arrangements, flanking the doors, petals scattered artfully along the stone pathway. The scent was overwhelming, almost cloying in its sweetness. Somewhere inside, I could hear the refined strains of a string quartet, probably playing Bach or Vivaldi, something appropriately sophisticated for the Powell family social circle. Other guests streamed past me, couples in expensive suits and designer dresses, laughing and greeting each other with the easy familiarity of people who belonged to the same world, attended the same country clubs, summered in the same exclusive locations. I recognised a few faces from business circles and society pages: a senator, a local news anchor, the CEO of a major tech company. The Powells had pulled out all the stops. No one acknowledged me as I entered. No receiving line, no usher asking my name, no warm welcome. I was just another body filling a seat, another witness to Daniel Powell's perfect day. Inside the main hall took my breath away despite myself. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens where the ceremony would take place. Round tables dressed in cream linens filled the space, each centerpiece a towering arrangement of white roses and hydrangeas. Candlelight flickered from what must have been hundreds of votives. At the far end, a small symphony orchestra was setting up actual orchestra musicians for a wedding reception. The Powell family didn't do anything by halves. I stood in the entrance, suddenly acutely aware that I had no idea where I was supposed to go. The invitation hadn't included a table assignment. I watched other guests find their names on an elegant seating chart displayed on a gold easel, exclaiming with delight when they discovered they'd been seated with friends. A young woman in the black and white uniform of the catering staff approached me with a professional smile. "Can I help you find your table, ma'am?" "I'm Christina Hart. I don't see my name on the chart." She checked her tablet, scrolling through what I assumed was the guest list. Her smile faltered slightly. "Ah, yes, Miss Hart. You're at table 18, if you'll follow me." Table 18. I didn't need to know the table numbers to understand what that meant. As she led me through the glittering hall, past tables 1 through 17, past the tables near the dance floor, and the head table where the wedding party would sit, past the tables where I recognised prominent business leaders and family friends, I knew exactly where we were going. The overflow table, the corner table, the table for guests who were invited out of obligation, people who didn't quite fit into the main event. It was positioned near the kitchen doors, far enough from the centre of the room that you couldn't really see the dance floor without craning your neck. The other seats at the table were already occupied by people I didn't recognise. An elderly couple who appeared to be arguing in whispers, a middle-aged woman checking her phone with obvious boredom, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Here you are," the staff member said brightly, as if I'd been given a prime seat. "Enjoy the wedding." I sat down slowly, placing my small clutch on the table. The elderly couple glanced at me briefly, then returned to their argument. The woman on her phone didn't even look up. No one introduced themselves. No one asked who I was or how I knew the happy couple. I didn't introduce myself either. What would I say? I'm the adopted daughter, the obligation, the charity case who made something of herself, but still isn't quite good enough to sit with the family. The woman who postponed a $300 million deal to be here to sit at table 18 in the corner by the kitchen. I sat in silence, hands folded in my lap, watching the room fill with laughter and champagne and the easy joy of people who belonged. The orchestra began to play a soaring melody that seemed designed to make everything feel more magical, more perfect. That's when I saw her. Elaine Powell, resplendent in a floor-length gown of pale champagne silk, her hair styled in an elaborate updo, diamonds at her throat and wrists. She was holding court near the centre of the room, greeting guests with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent her entire life in high society. She turned, scanning the room, and her eyes landed on me. For a moment, I thought she might pretend not to see me, might let me fade into the background of this extravagant event. But no. She excused herself from her conversation and began walking toward my table, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Every step felt measured, deliberate. My heart began to race. Maybe this was it. Maybe she was coming to tell me there had been a mistake, that I should be sitting with the family, that I belonged at the front of the room, not hidden in the corner. She reached my table and stopped looking down at me with that smile I knew so well, the one that never quite reached her eyes, the one that said she was performing graciousness rather than feeling it. "Oh, honey," Elaine said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "we didn't forget you." Before I could respond, before I could process what that statement even meant, a server appeared at my elbow. He was carrying a tray, and on that tray, incongruous among all the crystal and china and elegant place settings surrounding me, was a single white bowl. He set it down in front of me carefully, as if it were fine dining. It was a bowl of cereal. Not even expensive cereal, just plain cornflakes in a white ceramic bowl with a small carton of milk beside it and a plastic spoon. The kind of breakfast a child might eat on a school morning. The kind of meal you give someone when you can't be bothered to make them anything better. Around me at the other tables, I could see from my corner position, servers were presenting the first course of what was clearly going to be an elaborate multi-course meal. Seared scallops on beds of microgreens, delicate portions of prosciutto-wrapped asparagus, tiny portions of something that looked like it cost more per bite than my entire bowl of cereal cost per box. I stared at the bowl, at the cheerful yellow flakes, at the plastic spoon that didn't match the sterling silver flatware at every other place setting in the room. Elaine was already walking away her duty, done her token acknowledgement complete. She'd made sure I knew I was remembered, and she'd made sure I knew exactly how I was remembered. Then I heard it. The sound that would replay in my mind for years to come. Laughter. It started from the head table where the wedding party sat in all their finery. Daniel, my brother, the groom, in his custom-tailored tuxedo, stood up with a champagne flute in his hand. His face was flushed with alcohol and happiness, and the supreme confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything in his entire life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the hall with the easy projection of someone used to commanding attention. "I'd like to propose a toast." The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him. I felt my face burning, knowing with absolute certainty what was coming. "To family," Daniel said, and then his eyes found me in my corner. That smile on his face, the one I remembered from childhood, the one that appeared right before he did something cruel. "Even the adopted ones. She's just the adopted one, folks. Give her cereal, it's enough." The head table erupted first, his groomsmen young men in matching tuxedos, who probably came from families just like his, threw their heads back and laughed. The bridesmaids, beautiful women in lavender silk, covered their mouths and giggled. Some of the guests at the surrounding VIP tables joined in that uncomfortable laughter of people who weren't sure if they were supposed to find it funny, but didn't want to seem out of step. I looked at Elaine. She had one manicured hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, but she was smiling behind that hand. Not laughing, outright maintaining her social grace, but definitely amused. The perfect picture of a mother indulging her son's joke, even at someone else's expense. Richard Powell sat beside her, and for just a moment our eyes met. I saw something flicker across his face, discomfort maybe, or possibly shame. But then he did what he'd always done. He looked away, picked up his champagne glass, pretended I wasn't there, wasn't hurting, wasn't drowning in humiliation in front of 200 people. The laughter continued rolling through the room in waves. Not everyone was laughing. Some people looked confused, others uncomfortable, but enough people were laughing that it felt like the whole world was in on the joke. The joke that was me. The joke that had always been me. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and did what I'd learned to do as a child. I disappeared inside myself. I went to that quiet place where their words couldn't touch me, where their cruelty couldn't reach. I'd survived years of this. I could survive one more moment. Except this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't a child. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't dependent on their charity or their approval. I had built something they knew nothing about. I had power they'd never bothered to recognize because they'd never bothered to see me as anything more than an obligation, a tax deduction, a story they told at their charity galas about their own generosity. Michael's words came back to me. You don't owe them your dignity. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. Surprisingly, perfectly steady. The laughter was starting to fade, people returning to their conversations, the moment passing, into the general buzz of wedding reception chatter. Daniel sat back down, accepting congratulations and backslaps from his friends. Elaine was smiling at someone, her social mask perfectly in place. Richard was checking his own phone, probably already thinking about business, about Monday morning, about anything other than what had just happened. None of them were looking at me anymore. I'd served my purpose. I'd been the punchline. Now I could fade back into invisibility. I pulled up my contacts and found the number I needed. Sarah Mitchell, my executive assistant, the woman who'd been with me since Sterling's founding, who knew every deal we had in motion, who understood exactly how much power I actually wielded. The phone rang twice before she answered. Christina, is everything okay? I thought you were at a wedding. I am, I said, and my voice was calm, eerily calm. The voice I used in boardrooms when I was about to make a decision that would change everything. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Right now. Of course. What do you need? I looked at the bowl of cereal, at Daniel laughing at the head table, at Elaine networking effortlessly, at Richard who had never once stood up for me. Cancel the deal with Powell Industries, I said clearly. The $300 million financing agreement, kill it, effective immediately. Call our legal team, call their legal team. I want it done in the next 10 minutes. There was a pause. Christina, are you sure that deal took 6 months to negotiate? It's the biggest. I'm absolutely sure. Do it now. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. That was the thing about real power. It didn't need to shout. I ended the call and set my phone on the table. Then I did something I'd never done before in the presence of the Powell family. I looked up. I met the eyes of everyone at that head table one by one. I smiled. The laughter died. The entire room froze. It was remarkable, really, how quickly joy could drain from a space. One moment there had been music and conversation and the pleasant din of celebration, and the next there was nothing but silence and the distant clinking of a glass someone had set down too hard. I watched the realization move across faces like a wave. The people at table 18, my fellow overflow guests, stared at me with confusion. The tables nearby had heard my voice, heard the word cancel and Powell Industries and $300 million, and were leaning toward each other, whispering frantically. At the head table, Daniel's smile had frozen on his face, transforming into something uncertain. But Richard Powell had heard every word. I saw the exact moment it registered. He'd been looking at his own phone, probably reading an email or checking stock prices, and then he'd glanced up at the sudden silence. His eyes found me, and I watched his face go from confusion to comprehension to a rage so pure it was almost fascinating. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "You can't do that!" His voice cracked across the room like a whip, shattering the silence into 1,000 uncomfortable pieces. "You don't have that authority." Every single person in that wedding hall turned to look at me. 200 faces, 200 pairs of eyes, all focused on the woman in the white dress sitting in the corner with a bowl of cereal in front of her. I stood slowly with deliberate grace. I picked up the cloth napkin that had been placed beside my cereal bowl, unfolded it calmly and set it down on the table. The gesture felt significant, somehow final. A closing of accounts. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying in the silence with perfect clarity, "I'm the CFO and majority decision maker at Sterling Financial Group. The deal was structured through my division. I have exactly that authority." Richard's face was turning an alarming shade of red. He started moving toward me, weaving between tables, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. Elaine reached for his arm, but he shook her off. Other guests pressed back against their chairs, creating a path, no one wanting to be caught in the trajectory of his fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" He was shouting now, all pretense of social grace abandoned. That deal represented a third of our projected capital for the next fiscal year. You can't just cancel it because your feelings were hurt. My feelings were hurt, I repeated, tasting the words. 30 years of hurt dismissed in a single phrase. I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a nice smile. "No, Mr. Powell. My feelings were hurt when I was 8 years old and you forgot my birthday. My feelings were hurt when I was 14 and you left me out of the family vacation. My feelings were hurt when I was 22 and you didn't come to my college graduation." I gestured at the bowl in front of me. This isn't about hurt feelings." "Then what is it about?" Elaine had appeared beside Richard, her face pale beneath her careful makeup. Her voice was shaking. "Christina, please, whatever this is, we can talk about it. Don't do something you'll regret." "What will I regret, Mrs. Powell? Standing up for myself, finally using the power I've built to show you that I'm not the helpless little girl you took in, that I'm not someone you can humiliate for entertainment." I looked at Daniel, still frozen at the head table, his bride-to-be clutching his arm with growing alarm. "You shouldn't have given me cereal." The simplicity of that statement seemed to hit harder than any elaborate speech could have. I watched Elaine's face crumple slightly, watched her understand that this wasn't about business or money or power plays. This was about decades of small cruelties, of thoughtless dismissals, of being made to feel less than human by the people who were supposed to be my family. "This is my wedding." Daniel finally found his voice, standing up so abruptly his chair tipped backward. "You're ruining my wedding because of a joke, because you can't take a joke." "No," I said quietly. "I'm leaving your wedding because I finally understand that I was never supposed to be here in the first place. Not really. Not as family." I picked up my clutch and stepped away from the table. My legs felt steady beneath me, stronger than they'd ever felt. I'd spent so many years trying to earn a place at their table, trying to prove I deserved their love, their acceptance, their basic respect. And in one moment, in one phone call, I'd realised something liberating. I didn't need their table. I'd built my own. As I walked toward the exit, the crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. They just stared, these people in their expensive clothes with their expensive tastes, watching a woman in a simple white dress walk away from everything she'd supposedly wanted her whole life. I passed the table where the wedding cake stood 5 tiers of elaborate fondant and sugar flowers. I passed the gift table piled high with expensive presents in gleaming paper. I passed the orchestra, their instruments silent, the musicians watching me with expressions I couldn't read. At the entrance, I paused and looked back one final time. Richard was still standing in the middle of the room, his phone now pressed to his ear, probably calling his own assistants, his lawyers, anyone who might be able to undo what I'd just done. Elaine had sunk into a chair, one hand pressed to her mouth, her champagne glass trembling in the other hand. Daniel was yelling something, slamming his hand on the table, hard enough to make the crystal jump, his phone also out, now his face contorted with rage. The bride, Vanessa, stood alone in her beautiful white gown, looking around in confusion at her wedding reception that had just imploded. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine. The air felt cleaner out here, easier to breathe. The valet hurried over with my keys, his eyes wide, clearly having heard some version of what had just happened inside. I tipped him, got in my car and drove away from the Grandview estate without looking back. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached the main road. Sarah, probably with confirmation that the deal was killed. Michael, undoubtedly, having heard already through the industry grapevine that moved at the speed of light when scandal was involved. Other numbers I didn't recognise, likely reporters or colleagues or people who'd heard whispers of what had just happened. I let them all ring. I drove back toward the city with my windows down, the wind pulling at my hair, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. Behind me, I knew chaos was unfolding. Legal teams scrambling, PR departments crafting statements, the Powell family trying to understand how their adopted daughter, their charity case, their afterthought had just destroyed their biggest business deal of the year with a single phone call. By midnight, the story would be on every financial news site. By morning, it would be everywhere. But that was 12 hours away. For now, I just drove. 12 hours became 24, then 48, then 72. 3 days that felt like 3 years, watching the consequences of a single phone call ripple outward in ways even I hadn't fully anticipated. Sunday morning, I woke in my penthouse to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The financial news sites had already picked up the story. Sterling Financial abruptly cancels major deal with Powell Industries, read the first headline I saw. By noon, the story had evolved. CFO pulls $300 million financing after family wedding. Incident. By evening, someone had leaked more details, and the headlines turned salacious. Mystery, CFO cancels deal after wedding humiliation, cereal served instead of dinner. The internet predictably lost its mind. I stayed in my apartment that Sunday, watching the story spread like wildfire across social media. People were divided. Some called me petty, unprofessional, a spoiled brat who'd weaponized her business position over a personal slight. Others called me a hero, someone who'd finally stood up to family mistreatment, who'd proven that adopted children deserved respect. The hashtags multiplied by the hour. But the real damage was happening in the markets. Monday morning, when the stock exchange opened, Powell Industries stock began to fall. Not dramatically at first, just a few percentage points in the first hour. But then the circuit breakers kicked in, those automatic trading halts designed to prevent panic selling. The stock would drop 10%, trading would pause for 15 minutes, then resume only to drop again. By Monday, close, Powell Industries had lost 28% of its value. I knew what was happening because I designed it to happen. The cancelled deal wasn't just about the $300 million in immediate financing. It was about what that cancellation signalled to the market, that Sterling Financial Group, one of the most respected firms in the industry, had deemed Powell Industries too risky to do business with. And if we thought they were risky, other investors wondered, what did we know that they didn't? Tuesday morning, I made 5 phone calls. Private calls to CFOs and investment partners at companies that had existing relationships with Powell Industries. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. I simply mentioned that Sterling had conducted enhanced due diligence on Powell's financials and decided to step away. I noted some concerning debt ratios. I raised questions about their capital structure and long-term sustainability. I never explicitly told anyone to withdraw from their Powell partnerships. I just planted seeds of doubt in already nervous minds. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 major partners had announced they were re-evaluating their strategic relationships, with Powell Industries. A fourth quietly cancelled a planned joint venture. The stock fell another 12%. Total damage over 3 days, 40% of the company's market value, nearly $500 million in shareholder wealth gone. The media had evolved from curiosity to full feeding frenzy. Reporters camped outside Sterling's offices. My phone rang constantly with interview requests. Someone had found my college graduation photo and posted it online beside a photo from Daniel's wedding, creating a before and after narrative that wasn't entirely accurate, but made for compelling social media content. I was simultaneously being praised as a feminist icon, standing up to family abuse, and condemned as a vindictive woman who'd let personal feelings destroy a business relationship. I gave no interviews, made no statements. Let my silence speak for itself. Tuesday evening, my assistant Sarah buzzed my office intercom. Her voice was tight with tension. "Christina, Richard Powell is here. He's demanding to see you. Security has him in the lobby, but he's refusing to leave." I should have expected this, should have prepared for it, but hearing his name still sent a jolt through my system, that old childhood fear response that no amount of professional success had fully erased. "Send him up," I said. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure I can have security escort him out?" "So send him up." 5 minutes later, Richard Powell walked into my corner office. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His suit was still expensive, still perfectly tailored, but his face was haggard. Dark circles under his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands. This was a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "Christina," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. I stood at my window, looking out over the city, my back to him. I didn't turn around, didn't offer him a seat, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond the fact that I'd allowed him into my space. "Please," he continued, "we need to talk about this. What you've done, what you're doing, it's destroying everything I've built. 40 years of work, 40 years of building Powell Industries into something significant, and you're tearing it down because of what? A bowl of cereal. A stupid joke at a wedding." I remained silent, watching the city below. Cars moving through streets, people going about their lives, the world continuing to turn regardless of the drama playing out in this office. "I know we weren't perfect," Richard said, and I could hear him moving closer behind me. "I know Elaine could be cold sometimes. I know Daniel was cruel when you were children. But we gave you a home, Christina. We gave you opportunities. We paid for your education, You gave me a roof," I said, still not turning around. "You gave me food and clothing and tuition payments. You gave me everything except the one thing that mattered." "What? What didn't we give you?" "Love, basic human dignity. The feeling that I was worth more than a tax deduction and a story you told at charity dinners." I finally turned to face him. "You gave me everything money could buy and nothing that actually cost you anything. And now you're here in my office begging me to undo what I've done, and you still don't understand what you did wrong." His face twisted. "So this is revenge punishment. You're going to destroy my company, put hundreds of people out of work, ruin lives, all because your feelings were hurt." "No," I said quietly. "I'm going to let your company face the natural consequences of being built on unstable foundations. The financial instability was already there, Mr. Powell. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it." "That's not true. Our financials are solid. Your debt-to-equity ratio is dangerously high. Your cash reserves are insufficient for your operational needs. You've been using aggressive accounting practices to mask declining profit margins. Should I go on?" I watched his face pale. "I'm very good at my job, Mr. Powell. I saw all of this during our due diligence. I was willing to overlook it, restructure the deal to protect both our interests. But that was when I still believed I owed you something." "I'll change," he said desperately. We'll change. The whole family. We'll treat you better, include you more. Just restore the deal. Make a statement that you've reconsidered. The stock will recover. Our partners will come back. No. The single word hung in the air between us. Final. Absolute. Richard stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant he understood. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something he could fix with promises or money or charm. This was done. He left without another word, his shoulders slumped in defeat. After the elevator doors closed behind him, I returned to my window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. My phone buzzed, Michael asking if I was still in the office. He appeared in my doorway minutes later, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He set one on my desk and stood beside me at the window. That was Richard Powell leaving the building just now, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. How did it go? About as expected. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, almost reluctantly, he asked the question I'd been asking myself for 3 days. Are you sure this is what you want? I turned from the window to look at Michael. His face was shadowed in the fading light, concern etched in every line. It was a fair question, an important question. And I didn't have a simple answer. I don't know what I want anymore, I admitted. I know what I did, I know I can't undo it, and I know they deserved it. But do I want this? I gestured vaguely at my phone still buzzing with notifications. This circus no, but I'm not sorry I did it. Michael nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. Well, whatever comes next, you know I'm with you. Sterling is with you. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But I was about to learn just how quickly with you could become distancing ourselves from you when the stakes got high enough. Wednesday morning, I woke to a media landscape that had shifted overnight. The narrative had changed. Where before the story had been about a business deal gone wrong, about family dysfunction and public humiliation. Now it was about something else entirely. The headline on the New York Post made my stomach drop. Obsessed adopted sister destroys brother's company after he rejected her advances. I read the article 3 times, each time feeling more sick. According to unnamed sources close to the Powell family, I'd harboured romantic feelings for Daniel since we were teenagers. When he'd gotten engaged to Vanessa, I'd become increasingly unstable, jealous, possessive. The wedding invitation had been a final attempt to include me in the family, despite my concerning behaviour, and I'd responded by trying to ruin Daniel's happiness and destroy the family business. It was so absurd, so transparently false that I almost laughed. Almost. Except the article included quotes that sounded just plausible enough to make people wonder. Christina always had trouble accepting that Daniel and I were siblings, nothing more, the article quoted Daniel saying. As we got older, it became uncomfortable. I tried to maintain distance while still being kind, but I think that made things worse. I never wanted to hurt her, but I couldn't return feelings that were inappropriate. There were photos too. Pictures I didn't even remember being taken from family gatherings years ago, carefully selected and cropped to support their narrative. One showed me looking at Daniel at some Christmas party, my expression serious. The caption read, Christina Hart gazing at her adoptive brother, Daniel Powell. Family sources say her obsession began in their teenage years. Never mind that in the full photo, which I vaguely remembered, I'd been looking past Daniel at my friend who was standing behind him. Another photo showed me alone, at what looked like a company party, holding a drink, my face caught in an unflattering expression. Hart known for erratic behaviour at a sterling financial event last year. By noon, the story had spread everywhere. TMZ picked it up. Entertainment news shows discussed it. Social media exploded with hot takes. The hashtags from before, the ones that had positioned me as a victim standing up to family abuse, were being drowned out by new ones. #obsessed sister, #fake victim, psycho adopted. I discovered that Elaine had hired Morrison & Chase, one of the most expensive and ruthless PR firms in the country. They specialized in reputation management for high-profile clients, and they were very, very good at what they did. Within 48 hours, they'd completely reframed the narrative. I wasn't the wronged adopted daughter anymore. I was the disturbed, obsessive woman who'd weaponized her business position to punish a family that had only ever tried to help her. Thursday brought more ammunition. A tabloid published an interview with someone claiming to be my college roommate, though I didn't recognize the name or photo. She described me as intense and fixated on her adoptive family, and said I talked about Daniel constantly and became visibly upset when he started dating. None of it was true. I'd barely mentioned my family in college, had actively avoided talking about them. But truth didn't matter when you had professionals crafting a narrative. Daniel himself appeared on a morning talk show, playing his role perfectly. He wore a simple suit, not too expensive, just expensive enough. His expression was pained but forgiving. "I don't hate Christina," he told the sympathetic host. "I feel sorry for her. Adoption can create complex feelings, and I think she never fully processed being brought into our family. My parents tried everything to make her feel loved and included, but sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes professional help is needed." The implication was clear without him having to say it explicitly. I was mentally unstable, needed therapy, was not a reliable narrator of my own life. The host nodded sympathetically. "And now, she's used her position in finance to hurt your family's company. I think she's hurting," Daniel said, his voice dripping with false compassion. Hurt people. I just hope she gets the help she needs before she destroys everything she's built for herself." I watched that interview in my office with my door closed, my hand shaking with rage. The smoothness of it, the calculated sympathy, the way he'd positioned himself as the mature, forgiving brother dealing with a disturbed sister. It was masterful. It was monstrous. Friday afternoon, I was called into an emergency meeting with Sterling's board of directors. 7 people sat around the conference table, their faces carefully neutral. These were people I'd worked with for years, people who knew my character, my work ethic, my judgment. James Whitmore, the chairman, spoke first. "Christina, we need to discuss the current media situation and its impact on Sterling's reputation." "The allegations are false," I said immediately. "All of it. The Powell family is engaging in a deliberate smear campaign to deflect from their own business problems." "We're not here to determine truth or falsehood," another board member, Patricia Chen, said carefully. "We're here to discuss optics and company exposure. Several of our clients have expressed concern. They're worried about being associated with controversy." "Controversy I didn't create," I pointed out. "The Powells are the ones spreading lies." "Nevertheless," James continued, "we think it might be wise for you to take a temporary leave of absence, just until things settle down. We'd position it as a voluntary step back to focus on personal matters. No admission of wrongdoing, just a cooling off period." I looked around the table. Most of them wouldn't meet my eyes. These people who I'd made wealthy, who'd benefited from my financial acumen, who'd celebrated my successes at every quarterly meeting, were now asking me to disappear because my presence had become inconvenient. "How temporary?" I asked. 60 days to start. We can reassess from there." 60 days. 2 months for the Powell family to further cement their narrative while I remained silent, seemingly in disgrace. 2 months for clients to forget my successes and remember only the scandal. 2 months for my enemies to paint me as whatever they wanted me to be. "I need time to consider," I said. "We need an answer by Monday," James replied. I left the meeting and went straight to Michael's office. He took one look at my face and closed his laptop. "They want me gone," I said. "Temporary leave, 60 days. Michael's jaw tightened. "Those cowards. After everything you've built for this company. They're protecting their interests. I understand it, even if I hate it. There's something else you need to know. Michael pulled up something on his computer and turned the screen toward me. I've been monitoring the Powell camp's activities. They're not just running a PR campaign, Christina. They've hired a legal team, a big one, and they're meeting with forensic accountants. My stomach dropped. They're looking for something to use against me. They're not just defending themselves, Michael said seriously, his eyes locked on mine. They're planning something bigger. Michael's words hung in the air between us like a threat. If the Powells were hiring forensic accountants and building a legal team, they weren't just trying to repair their reputation. They were preparing to attack mine in court. They'd sue me, claim I'd acted inappropriately, breached fiduciary duty, anything to discredit me professionally, and force Sterling to settle just to make the problem go away. I could play defense, wait for their next move, let them control the narrative. Or I could do what I'd always done best in business, find leverage. I need information, I said to Michael. Real information, not PR spin or media narratives. I need to know why they took me in. I need to know what they're hiding. What do you think they're hiding? I don't know yet, but people don't react this viciously unless they're protecting something. Richard Powell built a fortune over 4 decades. Elaine married into old money and social status. They could have ignored me my entire life, could have minimized contact after I turned 18. Instead, they kept me close enough to hurt, but far enough to never belong. That's not just cruelty, that's control. And I want to know what they were controlling. By Monday morning, I'd hired someone who could help me find answers. Marcus Webb was a private investigator who specialized in corporate backgrounds and family histories. He came highly recommended by one of Sterling's attorneys, described as discreet, thorough, and expensive. I didn't care about the expense. We met at a coffee shop far from my office, away from the reporters who'd started following me. Marcus was in his 50s, grey-haired and unremarkable looking, exactly the kind of person you'd never notice in a crowd. I need everything you can find about Richard Powell, I told him. Not his public business history, I can get that myself. I need the personal stuff. The gaps in his resume. Old employees, former business partners, anyone who knew him 30 to 40 years ago. What exactly are we looking for? I don't know, I admitted. But I was adopted at age 6 in 1996. I want to know what happened in the years before that. Why me, specifically? How did they find me? What was going on in Richard Powell's life that made him decide to adopt? Marcus nodded, making notes. What about your biological parents? Do you know anything about them? My mother died when I was young. I was told my father was never in the picture. I have my original birth certificate somewhere, but I haven't looked at it in years. Find it, Marcus said. Bring it to me. Original documents sometimes tell stories people don't want told. It took me 3 days to locate my birth certificate. I'd packed it away years ago in a safe deposit box along with other papers from my childhood adoption records, school transcripts, things I'd kept but never wanted to look at. When I finally held the document in my hands again, I saw what I'd never noticed as a child. The father section had been whited out. Not left blank, not marked unknown, but covered with correction fluid that had yellowed with age. Someone had deliberately obscured that information. I brought it to Marcus at our second meeting. He held it up to the light, examined it from different angles, then pulled out a small UV flashlight from his bag. There are ink traces under the correction fluid, he said. I know someone who might be able to lift this without damaging the document. It'll take a few days. While Marcus worked on that, he'd already started digging into Richard Powell's past. What he found was interesting. In 1989, Powell Industries had employed a woman named Eleanor Reyes as an executive assistant. She'd worked directly for Richard for 2 years, then disappeared from all records in late 1990. No forwarding address, no references to other employment, just gone. The timeline made my skin prickle. If Eleanor had disappeared in 1990 and I was born in early 1991, if someone had whited out my father's name on my birth certificate, if Richard and Elaine Powell had adopted me specifically rather than going through normal channels. Keep digging into Eleanor Reyes, I told Marcus. Find out what happened to her. Find out if there's any connection to me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus discovered that the Powell family's legal affairs in the 90s had been handled by a small firm, and one of the partners, a man named Harold Brennan, was still alive and living in a retirement community upstate. I drove there myself on a Thursday afternoon, 2.5 weeks after the wedding. The facility was pleasant enough, well-maintained gardens and comfortable common areas. Harold Brennan was 83 years old, thin and frail, but his eyes were still sharp when I introduced myself. Christina Hart, Scar, I said, extending my hand. Though you probably knew me as Christina Powell. His face went pale, his hand trembled when he shook mine. You shouldn't be here. I need to know about my adoption, about why Richard Powell chose me specifically. You handled their legal affairs back then. You must know something. I can't talk about client matters, attorney-client privilege. Mr. Brennan, the Powells are trying to destroy my reputation and possibly sue me. I need to know what I'm dealing with. Please, I'm not asking you to betray anyone's confidence. I just need to understand my own history. He looked at me for a long moment, his watery eyes searching my face. You look like her, he said finally. Like Elena. Same eyes, same expression when you're worried. My heart started pounding. Eleanor Reyes, she was my mother. Harold stood abruptly, his chair scraping. I can't do this. I'm sorry. You seem like a good person, and what they did to you at that wedding was cruel. I saw it on the news. But I took an oath. I have obligations. He started to walk away, heading back toward his room. I stood there, deflated, watching him go. This had been my best lead, and it was evaporating. Then Harold stopped. He stood still for a moment, his back to me before he spoke. I'm an old man. My memory isn't what it used to be. Sometimes I leave things lying around. Sometimes I forget where I put documents. He turned slightly, not quite looking at me. I'm going inside now. I'm going to take a nap. When I wake up in an hour, I expect you'll be gone, and that bench over there will be empty. He walked into the building, leaving me standing alone in the garden. I looked at the bench he'd indicated, a wooden seat partially hidden by flowering shrubs. There was nothing on it. I waited 5 minutes, then walked over. Still nothing. 10 minutes. 15. Then I saw it. A manila envelope tucked between the bench slats in the armrest, placed so carefully it would be invisible unless you were looking for it. My hand shook as I pulled it out. The envelope was old, the paper slightly brittle. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, faded with age, but still clear enough. It showed Richard Powell, younger by decades, his hair still dark. He was standing outside what looked like a hospital or medical building. And beside him, her hand resting on her visibly pregnant belly, was a woman with dark hair and eyes that looked exactly like mine. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a date, March 1990. I sat on that bench for 20 minutes, staring at the photograph, doing the math over and over. March 1990, 9 months before I was born. Elena Reyes, who looked exactly like me, pregnant and standing beside Richard Powell. The father column on my birth certificate deliberately obscured. My adoption, at age 6, by the man who'd gotten my mother pregnant. This wasn't charity. This was a cover-up. I drove back to the city, with the photograph on my passenger seat, glancing at it at every red light as if it might disappear or transform into something else. But it remained stubbornly real. Richard's hand on Elena's shoulder, her hand on her belly, both of them looking at the camera with expressions I couldn't quite read, hope maybe, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. By the time I reached Manhattan, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to Richard. Richard had spent my entire life avoiding direct confrontation, hiding behind Elaine's coldness and his own distant politeness. If I wanted the truth, I needed to go to the person who'd lived with this secret for 34 years, who'd raised another woman's child while resenting every moment of it. I needed to go to Elaine. The Powell estate was in Connecticut, a sprawling property in Greenwich that I'd visited countless times as a child and avoided entirely as an adult. I arrived just after sunset, the house lit from within, looking exactly as I remembered, imposing, elegant, unwelcoming. I didn't call ahead, didn't warn her I was coming. I simply drove through the gates that I still knew the code for, parked in the circular driveway, and rang the doorbell. A housekeeper I didn't recognise answered. "Can I help you? I'm here to see Mrs. Powell. Tell her it's Christina." The woman's eyes widened slightly. She clearly recognised my name from the news, but she nodded and disappeared inside. I stood on the doorstep where I'd stood so many times as a child, always feeling like a visitor in what was supposed to be my home. Elaine appeared in the foyer, still dressed impeccably despite the late hour. She'd lost weight in the past 3 weeks. Her face looked drawn older, but her posture was perfect, her expression controlled. "Christina, this is unexpected." Her voice was cool, measured. "I'm not sure we have anything to discuss after what you've done to this family. Let me in, Mrs. Powell. We need to talk. Trust me, you want this conversation to happen in private." Something in my tone must have convinced her. She stepped aside, allowing me into the marble entryway I'd walked through thousands of times. The house smelled the same furniture polish and fresh flowers and money, but it felt different now. Smaller, somehow less intimidating. She led me to the sitting room, the formal space reserved for important guests. We sat across from each other on antique chairs that had probably cost more than most people's cars. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, I placed the photograph on the coffee table between us. Elaine looked down at it. Every bit of colour drained from her face. Her hand, reaching for her water glass, froze mid-air. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what it shows. Richard and a pregnant woman named Eleanor Reyes. March 1990, 9 months before I was born. My mother, I assume." Elaine said nothing. She just stared at the photograph like it was a weapon I'd placed between us. Which, in a way, it was. "I know she worked for Richard," I continued. "I know she disappeared from all records in late 1990. I know someone whited out the father's name on my birth certificate. I know I wasn't some random orphan you charitably took in. So why don't you tell me what really happened? Why don't you tell me the truth about who I am? We gave you everything." Elaine's voice was stronger, now defensive. She looked up from the photograph, her eyes hardening. "A home. The best education money could buy. Opportunities most people would kill for. We raised, you clothed, you fed, you treated you like what? Like family, like a daughter." I leaned forward. "You treated me like a shameful secret you had to keep fed and housed but never actually love. Every day of my childhood I felt it. The coldness, the distance, the way you looked at me like I was something distasteful you had to tolerate. You don't understand what you're talking about." "Then help me understand. Tell me the truth. Was Richard my biological father?" Elaine stood abruptly, walking to the window, her back to me. Her shoulders were rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. "We gave you everything," she repeated, but her voice was shaking now. "More than she ever could have. More than you deserved." "More than I deserved." The words hit like a slap. What does that mean? What did a 6-year-old child do that made her undeserving of basic love and affection? You existed. Elaine spun around and I saw tears streaming down her face, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. You existed, and every time I looked at you, I saw his betrayal. I saw proof that my husband had been with another woman, that he'd loved someone else enough to... She broke off, pressing her hand to her mouth. Enough to... What, have a child with her? Is that what you can't bring yourself to say? I tried. Elaine's voice broke. I tried to see you as just a child who needed a home. I tried to separate you from what your mother did from what Richard did. But every time I looked at your face, I saw her. Every time you smiled with his expressions. You were a living, breathing reminder of the worst moment of my marriage. And I couldn't. Did you ever love me? I asked, and I heard my own voice crack. Even once, even for a moment, did you ever look at me and feel anything other than resentment? Elaine stood frozen, tears falling silently down her cheeks. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 30 years of pain and secrets. I wanted to, she finally whispered. When you first came to us, you were so small, so frightened. I remember thinking maybe this could work. Maybe I could forgive Richard if I could just love this child the way she deserved. But every day it got harder instead of easier. Every day you looked more like her. And I failed you. I failed as a mother. But you were never supposed to know the truth. Know what? I asked, my voice shaking. What truth am I not supposed to know? Elaine sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 62 years. She reached for a tissue from the side table, dabbed at her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice was flat, exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a weight for too long and was finally setting it down. That you're his daughter, his biological daughter. That Richard Powell is your father. The words hung in the air between us. I'd suspected it had done the math, had seen the evidence. But hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that photographs and speculation couldn't. My entire identity, everything I'd believed about myself shifted in that moment. Tell me everything, I said. I need to hear all of it. Elaine looked at the photograph still lying on the table, and something in her expression softened. Her name was Elena Reyes. She started working as Richard's executive assistant in 1989. She was 24 years old, beautiful, smart, ambitious. Everything I wasn't at that point in my marriage. She paused, her voice becoming bitter. I'd just had a miscarriage. My third one. The doctors told me I'd probably never carry a child to term. Richard and I were barely speaking. We'd built our entire marriage around the expectation of children of an heir to the Powell fortune, and suddenly that future was gone. So he had an affair. He said it wasn't an affair. He said it was a mistake one night when they'd worked late, when he'd had too much to drink, when he was grieving the loss of the child we'd never have. Elaine's hands twisted the tissue. But it was long enough. Eleanor got pregnant. I felt like I was watching my life story from outside my own body. What happened to her? She didn't tell Richard right away. She worked for another few months hiding it, and when she finally told him, she was almost 6 months along. Richard panicked. We'd been married 15 years by then. Powell Industries was growing rapidly, and he was being considered for several high-profile boards. A scandal like that would have destroyed everything: his reputation, his business, relationships, possibly the company itself. So he paid her off. No. Elaine's voice dropped. No, he wanted to do the right thing. That's what made it worse in a way. He wanted to divorce me, marry Eleanor, raise you properly. He was actually going to throw away everything we'd built for a woman he barely knew, and a child that wasn't supposed to exist. But he didn't. I convinced him not to. I told him the scandal would destroy him either way, that he'd lose the company, that his father's legacy would be ruined. I told him there was another way. Elaine looked at me directly for the first time since starting her story. I suggested we could adopt the baby. Privately. Quietly. We'd say we were adopting an orphan, which would be true enough once Elena signed away her parental rights. Richard could financially support her, make sure she was taken care of, and we'd raise you as our own. And Eleanor agreed to this. She didn't have much choice. Richard made it clear it was either that or nothing, She was young, unmarried, no family support. She signed the papers. Elaine's voice cracked. But she died during childbirth. Complications. You survived, but she didn't. So Richard never had to pay her off. Never had to worry about her changing her mind or coming back for you. It was almost convenient the way it worked out. The coldness in that last statement made me sick. You're talking about my mother's death as if it was fortunate. I'm telling you the truth. You wanted the truth. Elaine stood again, unable to sit still. After Eleanor died, we waited. You went into foster care for 6 years while we let enough time pass that no one would connect your adoption to Richard's former assistant. By the time we brought you home, everyone had forgotten about Eleanor Reyes. You were just a charitable adoption proof of our generosity. But you never stopped resenting me. I tried. Elaine's voice rose slightly. I honestly tried, Christina. But you have to understand what it was like. Richard mourned her. Not openly, not where anyone could see, but I saw it. I lived with a man who'd loved another woman enough to risk everything for her, and then she died, and he transferred all of that guilt and love and grief onto you. Every time he looked at you, he was looking at her. Every time he made sure you had the best of everything, he was trying to make up for what he'd done. And I was the woman who'd helped him hide his mistake. I was the wife he'd stayed with out of obligation, not love. I stood up, needing to move, needing to process this information that was rewriting my entire history. So all those years he knew, he looked at me every day knowing I was his daughter, and he never said anything, never claimed me, never stood up for me when Daniel was cruel or when you were cold. He just let me believe I was an outsider. He wanted to tell you, Elaine said quickly, especially as you got older, after you graduated college, after you'd made something of yourself in business. He was proud of you, Christina, genuinely proud. He wanted you to know you were his daughter, not just by adoption, but by blood. Then, why didn't he? Because I stopped him. Elaine's voice broke completely. Every time he tried to bring it up, I reminded him what it would mean. The questions it would raise, the scandal it would cause. Daniel would have to share his inheritance with you equally, maybe more than equally, if Richard decided to compensate you for all the years of deception. Our social circle would know we'd lied for decades, and Richard would have to face what he'd done to Elena, to you, to all of us. I turned to look at her, this woman who'd controlled my entire life through her silence and resentment. You kept me from knowing my own father. I kept this family together, Elaine said, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. Or, I thought I did. But I can see now I just made everyone miserable. Richard lived with guilt. Daniel grew up spoiled and cruel because I compensated for how I treated you. And you spent your whole life feeling like you weren't enough, when the truth is you were the only one of us who was real. I picked up the photograph from the table, looked one more time at Richard and Elena, at my parents together in a moment before everything fell apart. I'm not the outsider, I said quietly, more to myself than to Elaine. I was never the outsider. I'm his flesh and blood. I'm a Powell by birth, not by charity. Yes, Elaine whispered, tears streaming down her face. He wanted to tell you, but I stopped him every time. I left the Powell estate that night with more questions than answers, but at least now they were the right questions. I wasn't wondering why they'd never loved me. I was wondering how Richard had lived with himself all those years, looking at his own daughter and pretending she was someone else's responsibility. The truth didn't heal the wounds of 34 years. If anything, it made them deeper. But it also gave them context. And context, I was learning, was its own form of power. What I didn't know driving back to Manhattan that night was that I was about to watch the Powell family's carefully constructed world collapse entirely. The first domino fell on Monday morning, day 25 after the wedding. I was in my apartment still processing everything Elaine had told me when my phone exploded with notifications. The Securities and Exchange Commission had announced a formal investigation into Powell Industries for potential financial fraud and money laundering. The news sent shockwaves through the financial community. Powell Industries stock, already battered from the cancelled sterling deal, went into freefall. Trading was halted twice before noon due to circuit breakers. By market close, the company had lost another 30% of its value. I watched the coverage with a strange detachment. During Marcus's investigation into Richard's past, he'd uncovered something else. Irregularities in Powell Industries' financial statements. Shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands transactions that didn't quite add up. I'd sent that information to a contact at the SEC 2 weeks ago, anonymously through channels that couldn't be traced back to me or Sterling. The investigation had apparently found enough evidence to proceed. And while the charges were against Powell Industries as a corporate entity, the news reports made it clear that Daniel Powell, as COO and heir apparent, was the primary target of the investigation. It seemed my brother had been running a sophisticated money laundering operation through the company's international divisions, siphoning off millions into offshore accounts. Part of me felt satisfaction watching him face consequences for once in his privileged life. But another part, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, felt something else. Something grief maybe for what could have been if we'd actually been a family. Tuesday brought worse news. Powell Industries held an emergency press conference to address the SEC investigation. Richard, as CEO, stood before cameras and attempted to defend the company's practices. I watched the live stream from my office, and even through the screen I could see he wasn't well. His face was grey, his speech slightly slurred, his hands trembling as he gripped the podium. Halfway through his statement, he stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped, his mouth open, his eyes unfocused. Then he collapsed. The live stream cut to chaos. People rushing forward, someone screaming for an ambulance, reporters shouting questions. I sat frozen watching the feed switch to a technical difficulties screen, my heart pounding in my chest. My father had just collapsed on live television. The hospital reports came later that afternoon. Richard Powell had suffered a massive stroke. He was alive but in critical condition, unresponsive, in a medically induced coma, while his brain swelling was monitored. The prognosis was uncertain. I should have felt vindicated. This was the man who'd abandoned me emotionally while knowing full well I was his daughter. The man who'd stood by and watched me be humiliated at Daniel's wedding without saying a word. The man who'd valued his reputation more than his own child. But instead, I felt hollow. He was my father, and he might die before I ever got to confront him, before I ever got to hear him explain in his own words why he'd made the choices he had. Wednesday, I received an invitation to speak at a major industry conference about ethical leadership in finance. The timing was clearly intended to capitalize on my newfound notoriety. They wanted me to tell my story, to position myself as someone who'd stood up to corruption and family dysfunction. I declined immediately. I'd already become enough of a media spectacle. I didn't want more attention, more exposure, more drama. I wanted time to process what I'd learned, to figure out who I was now that my entire understanding of my identity had shifted. Michael found me in my office that evening, staring out at the city lights. I'd been doing that a lot lately, looking out windows, searching for something I couldn't name. "You heard about Richard?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "How are you feeling about it?" "I don't know." It was the most honest answer I had. He's my father, Michael, not just the man who adopted me. My actual biological father. And he never told me. He just let me spend my entire life feeling like I didn't belong, when the truth is, I belonged more than anyone. Michael was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. Then he moved closer, placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through. Neither can I, and I'm living it. There's something you need to see." Michael pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and set it on my desk. "I've been doing some digging of my own. Quiet inquiries into Powell Industries' corporate structure, trying to understand their finances better in case they do try to sue you. And I found something. Something Richard set up years ago completely separate from Powell Industries, a private foundation that's been operating quietly for over a decade. He tapped the folder. I think he meant for you to find it eventually, or maybe he was waiting for the right time to tell you about it. I opened the folder. The first page was a legal document dense with corporate language and legal terminology, but the header was clear enough printed in bold letters across the top. Hope 19 Foundation Confidential. I stared at the folder, my mind struggling to process yet another secret, another hidden truth. Hope 19, the number meant nothing to me. I looked up at Michael, about to ask what he'd found when I saw his expression. He looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Guilty. What is this? I asked. Michael sat down across from me and the movement seemed heavy, deliberate, like a man preparing to confess something he'd held inside too long. Before I explain what's in that folder, I need to tell you something else first. Something I should have told you years ago. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Michael, what are you talking about? He wouldn't meet my eyes. 10 years ago, when we first met at Morrison & Associates, do you remember how it happened? How I introduced myself? You were assigned to the same project I was. We were both junior analysts working on the Berkshire acquisition. No. He finally looked at me, and I saw pain in his face. That's what you were told. But I requested that assignment specifically. I requested to work with you. I don't understand. Michael pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then set it on the desk between us. It showed an email dated 10 years earlier. The sender was Richard Powell. The subject line read, Assignment C. Hart. My hands went numb. Richard hired me, Michael said quietly. He contacted me through a private security firm I'd worked for after college. He said his daughter was starting her career in finance, and he wanted someone to keep an eye on her, make sure she was safe, report back monthly on her well-being, her career progress, any threats or problems she encountered. No. The word came out as barely a whisper. No, you're lying. I'm not lying. I wish I was. Michael pulled more documents from his briefcase. Contracts, old emails, payment records. He paid me $2,500 a month for the first 3 years. I was supposed to stay close to you, become your colleague, maybe your friend, make sure you didn't get into trouble, that no one took advantage of you. He called it protective surveillance. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. Michael, my closest friend, my business partner, the one person I'd trusted completely, through all of this chaos, he'd been paid to be in my life. He'd been a hired employee just like the nannies and tutors and housekeepers of my childhood. So, everything was fake. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Our friendship, our partnership, Sterling Financial, all of it was just you following instructions, collecting a paycheck. No, Christina, listen to me. Michael reached across the desk, but I jerked away from his touch. It started that way. I won't lie to you about that. I took the job because I needed money and it seemed easy enough. But after a few months of working with you, seeing how brilliant you were, how hard you worked, how isolated you were. Don't. I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the floor. Don't you dare tell me you started to care. Don't insult me with that. It's the truth. After 3 years, I stopped taking his money. Look, he thrust a stack of uncashed checks at me. These are payments from Richard that I never deposited. I told him I couldn't accept money anymore because what I felt for you had become real. I couldn't be paid to care about someone I actually loved. The word loved made something break inside me. You loved me. You loved me while lying to me every single day for 10 years. I wanted to tell you so many times once. But how do you tell someone that your entire relationship started as a surveillance job? How do you explain that without destroying everything? Michael's voice was pleading now. I kept waiting for the right moment, but there was never a right moment. And then we became business partners and you trusted me and I couldn't. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. So you just kept lying? Yes, he dropped his head into his hands. Yes, I kept lying because I'm a coward, because I was terrified of this exact moment of seeing you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. But more than that, I wanted to hurt him the way I was hurting, wanted him to feel even a fraction of the betrayal tearing through me. Instead, I walked around the desk until I was standing directly in front of him. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes, like maybe I was going to say I understood that I forgave him. I slapped him. The sound cracked through the office. Michael's head snapped to the side, a red mark already blooming on his cheek. But he didn't move, didn't defend himself, just sat there accepting it. Get out. My voice was shaking, tears streaming down my face. Get out of my office. Get out of my life. Christina, please, get out. I was shouting now, not caring who heard. Everyone in my life has been a lie. My father who wasn't just my father. My mother who hated me for existing. My brother who I'm not even really related to. And now, you. The one person I thought actually chose to be in my life, who actually wanted to know me, you were bought and paid for like everyone else. Michael stood slowly gathering his briefcase. The uncashed checks lay scattered on my desk, proof of his claim, but they meant nothing. They changed nothing. He'd still started our relationship as a transaction. He'd still deceived me for a decade. He paused at the door, looked back at me one last time. The Hope 19 Foundation. It's yours. Everything in that folder, it's what Richard set up for you. You deserve to know what it says. He set his keycard on the side table. I'll email my resignation to the board tonight. You won't have to see me again. And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving me alone in my office with tears on my face and a folder full of more secrets I wasn't sure I had the strength to bear. I stood there for several minutes trying to breathe, trying to process this newest betrayal. Then, because I apparently couldn't stop myself from seeking out more pain, I sat back down and opened the Hope 19 folder. The first document was a letter handwritten on Richard Powell's personal stationery. It was dated 3 months ago, before any of this had started, before the wedding invitation, before everything fell apart. My dearest Christina, it began. I started crying before I finished the first paragraph. I read through my tears Richard's handwriting blurring and clearing as I blinked. His words were careful, deliberate, the words of a man who knew he might not get the chance to say these things in person. He wrote about Elena, about how he'd loved her in a way he'd never loved Elaine, how her death had broken something in him that never healed. He wrote about the day they brought me home from foster care, how he'd held me for the first time since I was a newborn, how he'd looked into my eyes and seen Elena looking back. I have failed you in every way a father can fail his daughter, he wrote. I let Elaine convince me that hiding the truth was the kindest option, that you'd be better off not knowing about the scandal and complications of your birth. But kindness and cowardice look similar from certain angles, and I chose cowardice every time it mattered. The letter went on for 3 pages, each paragraph, another admission of guilt, another apology that could never undo 30 years of emotional abandonment. But it was the final page that made me stop crying and start paying attention to the legal documents beneath the letter. I cannot give you back your childhood or the father you deserved, but I can give you what should have always been yours, your inheritance not as an adopted daughter, but as my biological child and rightful heir. Fioit, Hope 19. Foundation holds everything I've set aside for you. The name comes from the date I first held you, January 19th. You were my hope then, even when I was too weak to show it. I pulled out the next document. It was a trust agreement notarized and legally binding, dated 12 years ago. The Hope 19 Foundation was a sealed private trust containing $50 million in liquid assets and 20% of Powell Industries stock, all designated for Christina Elena Hart to be released upon her 35th birthday, or upon Richard Powell's death, whichever came first. 20%, not the 5% mentioned in Richard's public will that had been filed with the courts. 20%, which would make me the second largest shareholder in Powell Industries after Richard himself. I kept reading, my mind racing. There were two wills. The public will the one Elaine and Daniel knew about. Jai Bat left me 5% as a token gesture. But this sealed trust, known only to Richard and Harold Brennan, his former attorney, contained the real inheritance, 4 times what the public will specified, plus the $50 million fund. The next document made my blood run cold. It was a letter from Harold Brennan to Richard dated 8 years ago, explaining that Elaine had discovered the existence of the sealed trust. She'd confronted Harold, threatened to expose various privileged information about the firm's other clients unless he agreed to keep the trust hidden even after Richard's death. Harold had agreed, marking the trust as indefinitely sealed rather than setting a specific release date. Elaine had known. For 8 years, she'd known about my real inheritance and had actively worked to keep it from me. I stayed in my office until dawn, reading through every document in that folder, financial statements showing the trust's growth over 12 years. Letters from Richard to Harold expressing his wish that I be told the truth when I turned 30. Correspondence showing Harold's increasing discomfort with the deception and his ultimate capitulation to Elaine's demands. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, I'd made my decision. I picked up my phone and called Michael. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice rough with sleep or maybe tears. "Christina, I need to see you. Can you come to my office? I thought you never wanted to see me again." "I changed my mind, please. I need your help." He arrived 40 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shirt wrinkled, his usual composure completely gone. He stood in my doorway looking uncertain, like he wasn't sure whether to come in or run. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I pushed the Hope 19 folder across the desk toward him. "Read it," I said. "All of it." I watched his face as he went through the documents. Watched him process the trust fund, the hidden shares, Elaine's interference, all of it. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of shock and understanding. "This changes everything," he said. "Yes, it does." I took a breath, steadying myself. "What you did, what Richard paid you to do, it was wrong. You should have told me years ago. But I read his letter last night, and I understand something now. He loved me in his broken, inadequate way. He was trying to protect me the only way he knew how, and you were part of that. You were supposed to be the father, he couldn't be the guardian he couldn't admit to being. That doesn't excuse the lying." "No, it doesn't. But I also read those uncashed checks. 7 years of refusing payment. 7 years of choosing to be my friend when you could have walked away." I met his eyes directly. "I can't forgive you yet. I don't know if I ever can completely, but I believe you when you say your feelings became real. And right now I need someone I can trust, even if that trust is damaged." "What do you need?" "I need your help, not for money, not because you're obligated, but for justice. Elaine has been hiding my inheritance for 8 years. Daniel has been running the company into the ground with his illegal schemes. Richard is in a coma and might never wake up. And I'm the rightful heir to 20% of Powell Industries, which makes me a major shareholder, with the power to demand answers and accountability." Michael leaned forward. "You want to go public with this?" "Yes, I want to hold a press conference. I want to present the sealed trust, the real will, all of it. I want to expose what Elaine did and claim what's rightfully mine." "The Powells will fight you. They'll claim the documents are fraudulent, that you're making it up, that let them fight. I have Harold Brennan's testimony if I need it. I have the original notarized documents. I have truth on my side for once." I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in days. This time, they'll have to hear my voice. Planning the press conference took 5 days. 5 days of working with lawyers to verify every document, to ensure that nothing could be disputed or dismissed. 5 days of Michael and me working side by side in careful professional proximity, not quite friends, but not quite strangers either. 5 days of rehearsing what I would say, how I would present the truth in a way that was clear and undeniable. The press conference was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at the Grand Hyatt in one of their large conference rooms. My legal team advised a neutral location rather than Sterling's offices, or anywhere associated with the Powell family. This needed to be seen as an independent revelation of truth, not a business maneuver. I arrived an hour early, walking through a back entrance to avoid the reporters already gathering in the lobby. My lawyer, Catherine Morrison, met me in a small prep room with Michael and 2 junior associates who'd spent the past week authenticating every document in the Hope 19 folder. "The room is filling up fast," Catherine said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her notes one final time. "Every major financial publication is here. Business networks are carrying it live. You're going to have a significant audience." Good. I looked at my reflection in a small mirror on the wall. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit, professional, but not cold, powerful, but not aggressive. My mother's daughter, I thought, and felt a strange pang. Not Elaine, but Elena, the woman in the photograph, whose eyes looked like mine. "Are you ready?" Michael asked quietly. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." At exactly 2:00, we walked into the press conference room. The space was packed, every seat filled, cameras lining the back wall, the low murmur of conversation dying as I stepped up to the podium. I looked out at the sea of faces, reporters I recognized from financial news networks, journalists who'd been writing about the Powell family drama for weeks, photographers with cameras already clicking. Catherine stood to my right, Michael to my left. The 3 junior associates sat at a table beside us, the Hope 19 documents arranged in neat stacks in front of them ready to be referenced. I gripped the edges of the podium, took a breath, and began. "Thank you all for coming. I'm here today to set the record straight about my relationship with the Powell family and to reveal information that has been hidden for more than 3 decades. My voice was steady, stronger than I'd expected. There has been extensive media coverage about the incident at Daniel Powell's wedding and the subsequent business decisions I made. Much of that coverage has speculated about my motives, my character, and my mental stability. Today, I'm going to tell you the truth." I nodded to one of the associates, who pulled up the first image on the screen behind me, the photograph of Richard and Eleanor. This is a photograph of Richard Powell and Eleanor Reyes, taken in March of 1990. Eleanor Reyes was Mr. Powell's executive assistant. She was also my biological mother. The murmur that ran through the room was like a physical wave. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward in their seats. I was born in January 1991. My mother died during childbirth. For 6 years, I was in foster care while Richard Powell and his wife Elaine decided what to do about the child that resulted from his extramarital affair. Eventually, they adopted me, but they never told me the truth about my parentage. I grew up believing I was a charity case, an orphan they'd generously taken in. I was treated as an outsider, excluded from family events, made to feel less than, and I never understood why until 3 weeks ago. The next slide showed my birth certificate with the whited-out father's name. My birth certificate was deliberately altered to hide Richard Powell's paternity. For 34 years, I didn't know that the man I called my adoptive father was actually my biological father. I paused, letting that sink in. But Richard Powell knew. He knew every day of my life. And he set up a trust fund for me, the Hope 19 Foundation, to provide for me when the truth eventually came out. Catherine stepped forward and began presenting the legal documents, the trust agreement, the sealed will, the financial statements. She explained in clear legal terms that Richard Powell had designated 20% of Powell Industries stock and $50 million in liquid assets to me, Christina Elena Hart, his biological daughter and rightful heir. This trust was sealed by Richard Powell's attorney, Harold Brennan, with instructions to release it upon Ms. Hart's 35th birthday, or upon Mr. Powell's death, whichever came first, Catherine explained. However, Mrs. Elaine Powell discovered the trust's existence 8 years ago and coerced Mr. Brennan into keeping it sealed indefinitely. She actively prevented Ms. Hart from receiving her rightful inheritance. The room exploded with questions, but I held up my hand. There's more. The public will that was filed with the courts leaves me 5% of Powell Industries as a token gesture to his adopted daughter. But the sealed trust, the real will recognises me as his biological daughter, an heir entitled to 20%. I have all the original notarized documents here, authenticated by 3 independent legal experts. I also have testimony from Harold Brennan confirming everything I've said today. That's when the doors at the back of the room burst open. Daniel Powell stormed in, his face flushed, his suit dishevelled. He'd clearly rushed here from wherever he'd been when he'd heard about the press conference. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of Elaine, pale and shaking, being held back by security. "This is insane!" Daniel shouted, pushing through the crowd of reporters. "She forged those documents. She's making this up. Our father would never. She's lying." Security moved to intercept him, but I held up my hand. "Let him speak. I have nothing to hide." Daniel reached the front of the room, his eyes wild. "You've destroyed our company with your vindictive lies. First, you cancel the deal. Then, you report us to the SEC with false information. Then, you spread rumours about our finances, and now this. Now you're claiming to be our father's biological daughter. It's insane." Catherine stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Powell, if you have evidence that these documents are forged, please present it. Otherwise, I suggest you consult with your own legal team." She nodded to one of the associates who pulled up a new image on the screen, the notarized trust document from 12 years ago, with clear timestamps, signatures, and authentication marks. This document was notarized in 2013 by a state-certified notary public. The original is in a secure facility and has been examined by forensic document experts. The paper ink and timestamps all confirm its authenticity. Additionally, we have DNA test results comparing Ms. Hart's DNA to samples from Richard Powell's medical records taken with proper legal authorization. The results show a 99.97% probability of paternity. The room went silent. Daniel stood frozen, his mouth open, his face draining of colour. He looked at the screen, at the documents, at me standing calm and composed at the podium. "This isn't over," he whispered, but his voice carried in the silence. "This isn't over." Then the room erupted in applause. I should have taken those words more seriously. I should have recognised them for what they were, not the empty threat of a defeated man, but a promise of war from someone who had everything to lose. Instead, I let myself believe I'd won. The press conference had gone perfectly. The evidence was irrefutable. The DNA test, the authenticated documents, Harold Brennan's testimony, it was all there, clear and undeniable. As I walked out of that conference room with Catherine and Michael flanking me, reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Power, control, victory. That feeling lasted exactly 48 hours. Thursday morning, 2 days after the press conference, I woke to a notification that made my stomach drop. Daniel Powell had filed a lawsuit against me in New York State Supreme Court. The complaint was 30 pages long, dense with legal language, but the core allegation was simple and devastating. I had forged the hope. 19 foundation documents fabricated the sealed trust and manipulated a dying man's legacy for personal gain. I called Catherine immediately. "Have you seen this?" "I'm reading it now." Her voice was tight with concern. "He's hired Whitmore and Associates. They're one of the most aggressive litigation firms in the state. This isn't a defensive move, Christina. This is a full-scale attack. But we have the original documents. We have authentication from 3 independent experts. We have Harold Brennan's testimony. How can he possibly claim forgery? He doesn't need to prove forgery. He just needs to create enough doubt to tie this up in courts for years, and by the time the truth comes out, he'll have already destroyed your credibility. Catherine paused. There's something else. His legal team is requesting expedited discovery. They want access to all your communications with Richard over the past 10 years, all your emails, text messages, phone records. Fine, I have nothing to hide. I know, but they're going to be looking for anything they can twist. Any email where you complained about your treatment, any text where you expressed anger toward the family, they'll use it to paint you as someone with motive to forge documents. She was right, of course. I'd sent plenty of emails over the years venting to Michael about family dinners gone wrong, about being excluded from events, about feeling like an outsider. In context, they were the legitimate frustrations of someone being mistreated. But taken out of context, presented to a jury by skilled attorneys, they could look like evidence of a grudge of someone angry enough to commit fraud. Friday brought the next attack, and this one was more sophisticated. A new video appeared online posted by an account called Financial Truth Investigation. It showed footage of me from what appeared to be an interview sitting in a coffee shop, speaking to someone off camera. The video quality was grainy, but clear enough to see my face to hear my words. Richard Powell was weak, I heard myself saying. He let his wife control him, let his son run wild. He deserved to lose everything he built. Another clip, my voice harder, angrier. I've been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to take what should have been mine from the beginning. And the most damaging one. The documents, I knew exactly what I needed to make them look authentic. I've been in finance long enough to know how to create a paper trail. I watched the video 3 times, my hand shaking, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing and hearing. Those were my words, my voice, my face. But I'd never said those things. I'd never been interviewed in any coffee shop. I'd never spoken those sentences. Michael called within minutes of the video being posted. Don't watch it. It's fake. It has to be. It looks real. It sounds real. The technology exists to fake this kind of thing. Deep fakes, edited audio, AI-generated content. We'll get experts to analyze it to prove it's been manipulated. But the damage was already done. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. News outlets were covering it. Social media was exploding with hot takes. The narrative that had shifted in my favour after the press conference was shifting back. People who'd believed me were now questioning. People who'd been sceptical were now convinced I was a fraud. Saturday, I discovered how Daniel had created that video. A woman reached out to me through LinkedIn, someone I vaguely recognised as a junior reporter from a business blog. She said she'd been approached 3 weeks earlier by someone claiming to be a documentary filmmaker. He'd said he was working on a piece about women in finance and wanted to interview me. He'd provided her with questions to ask, told her it would help her career, paid her $2,000 to set up the interview. But I never actually interviewed you, she wrote in her message. You never showed up to the coffee shop. I waited for an hour and left. I didn't think anything of it until I saw that video. That's not real. I never spoke to you. She'd been a prop. They'd hired her to sit in a coffee shop to create the illusion of a legitimate interview setting. Then they'd used AI technology to insert my face and voice saying things I'd never said. It was sophisticated, expensive, and almost impossible for the average viewer to detect. Catherine brought in digital forensics experts to analyse the video. They confirmed what we suspected. The audio had been synthesised. The video had been manipulated. The metadata had been altered to make it appear older than it was. But proving that to the public was another matter. Technical explanations about audio frequencies and pixel analysis didn't make for compelling social media posts. The lie travelled faster than the truth could catch up. Sunday evening, a process server appeared at my apartment. I'd been served with the formal court summons. The trial was scheduled for 3 months out late September. Daniel's legal team was requesting a jury trial, meaning 12 ordinary people would decide whether I was telling the truth or committing elaborate fraud. Monday morning, I was called into another emergency meeting with Sterling's board. They looked even more uncomfortable than they had during our last meeting when they'd asked me to take a leave of absence. Christina, given the new developments, the lawsuit, the video evidence, the public controversy, we feel we have no choice, James Whitmore said. The board is requiring that you suspend all activities with Sterling Financial effective immediately until the legal matter is resolved. The video is fake. We have experts who can prove it. That may be true, but the court of public opinion moves faster than actual courts. Our clients are concerned. Our investors are nervous. We can't afford to be associated with this level of controversy while the legal questions are unresolved. So you're just going to let them win? Let Daniel Powell destroy my reputation with fabricated evidence, and you're going to help him by sidelining me? Patricia Chen spoke up, her voice gentler, but no less firm. We're not taking sides, we're protecting the firm. Once the trial concludes and your name is cleared, you can return to full duties. But until then, we need you to step back. I left that meeting feeling more defeated than I'd felt since the cereal incident at the wedding. Everything I'd built, everything I'd proven was being taken away by lies and manipulation. Michael found me in my office that evening packing up personal items. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down and pulled out his laptop. I've been working with the digital forensics team, he said finally. The video is definitely fake. But there's something else. Those emails Daniel's team submitted as evidence, the ones supposedly showing you threatening Richard Y, had our IT specialists analyze them. And the metadata is forged. The emails were created last week, not over the past 10 years like they claim. Whoever made them was good, but not good enough. There are timestamp inconsistencies, IP address anomalies. We can prove they're fabricated. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. How long will it take to prove it in court? Michael's expression was grim. That's the problem. The trial isn't for 3 months. We have time to build our case, but Daniel has time to build his too. And in the meantime, he's winning the public relations battle. So what do? We prepare. We gather every piece of evidence. We find out who he hired to create these forgeries, and we expose them. We turn this into what it is, a desperate man committing crimes to avoid losing his inheritance. Michael looked at me steadily. Court date is set for September 20th. We have 3 months to prove the truth. 3 months sounds like a long time until you're living through it, until every day is consumed with depositions and document reviews and experts explaining digital forensics in terms you barely understand. 3 months becomes an eternity and an instant, all at once. I moved through June, July, and August in a blur of legal preparation. My penthouse became a war room, the dining table covered in documents, my walls decorated with timeline charts and evidence logs. Catherine and her team visited almost daily, preparing me for testimony, anticipating every argument Daniel's attorneys might make, stress testing our evidence until we could defend it from every conceivable angle. Michael was there through all of it, maintaining that careful professional distance we'd established. We weren't friends the way we'd been before, might never be again. But we'd found a working relationship built on mutual respect and a shared goal. He coordinated with the digital forensics team while I worked with the lawyers. We divided the labour and tried not to think too hard about what we'd lost. The breakthrough came in early July. The forensic experts Michael had hired a team from MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory finished their analysis of the forged emails Daniel's team had submitted as evidence. What they found was damning. The emails claim to span a 10-year period. Doctor, Sarah Chen explained, pulling up her findings on her laptop in my living room. But the IP addresses tell a different story. Every single one of these emails originated from the same location, the offices of Whitmore and Associates, Daniel Powell's law firm. Not from Richard Powell's home computer, not from his office, not from any device he actually used. Can you prove that definitively in court? Catherine asked. Absolutely. IP addresses are like fingerprints. We can trace each email to the exact router it was sent from the exact timestamp it was created. Whoever forged these was sophisticated enough to fake the sender addresses and manipulate some of the metadata, but they couldn't hide the fundamental network data. These emails were all created within a 72-hour period in late May, just days before they were submitted to the court. And the video, I asked, the fake interview, also traceable. The audio synthesis software used to create your voice has a specific signature. We found fragments of the original audio files they used to train the AI recordings from your press conferences and media appearances. The video editing was done using professional software, and we've traced the license for that software to a digital media company that received a payment from a shell corporation. She pulled up another screen. That shell corporation received funding from an account controlled by Daniel Powell. It was all there. A trail of evidence showing deliberate, systematic fraud. Daniel hadn't just lied about my inheritance, he'd committed multiple crimes trying to discredit me. Forgery, fraud, possibly even identity theft, depending on how the prosecutors wanted to charge it. This is enough to win the case, Catherine said, reviewing the evidence, and possibly enough to file criminal charges against Daniel separately. But winning the case and clearing my name publicly were two different things. The trial was still 2 months away. In the meantime, I was still suspended from Sterling, still being treated as someone under investigation, still reading articles that questioned whether I was a fraud or a victim. I didn't know what was happening with Elaine. She'd vanished from public view after the press conference hadn't released any statements, hadn't appeared at any of Daniel's press events defending his lawsuit. Her silence was notable enough that reporters occasionally speculated about it, wondering if she'd turned against her son or simply retreated from the entire mess. What I couldn't know was what those 3 months had been like for her. I learnt later from conversations we'd have much further down the road what that summer had meant for Elaine Powell. She'd returned to the Greenwich estate after the press conference and found herself alone in a way she'd never been before. The staff had been let go one by one as the Powell fortune evaporated. Daniel was consumed with his lawsuit and his own legal troubles with the SEC. Richard remained in a coma at the hospital, neither improving nor declining, just existing in that terrible in-between state. Elaine spent her days wandering through that huge empty house, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been built on secrets and lies. She'd find herself in rooms she hadn't entered in years, the nursery she'd decorated, when she'd still believed she'd have children of her own, the study, where Richard used to work late into the night, probably thinking about Eleanor. One afternoon in late July, she'd gone up to the attic, looking for something, and found instead boxes of old photographs. Pictures from my childhood that had never made it into the family albums downstairs. There was 6-year-old me on my first day in their home, small and frightened, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. There was 10-year-old me at a school play, dressed as a tree, smiling at the camera, while Richard stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, in one of the rare photos where he actually touched me. Elaine had sat on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by these photographs, seeing for the first time what she'd refused to see for 30 years. A child who'd wanted nothing more than to be loved. A little girl who'd tried so hard to earn acceptance from people who'd decided before she ever arrived that she would never truly belong. Then, in mid-August, Richard woke up. It was brief, just a few minutes of consciousness before he slipped back into the coma. But those few minutes changed everything for Elaine. She'd been sitting beside his hospital bed as she did every Thursday afternoon, more out of duty than devotion. She'd been looking at her phone, scrolling through news articles about the upcoming trial when she heard him make a sound. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding her face. "Elaine," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Richard, oh God, Richard, you're awake. Let me call the nurse." "No, wait." His hand moved weakly, finding hers. "Christina, where is she? There's a trial. Daniel is suing her. It's complicated. Protect her." Richard's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Please, I failed her. Don't let Daniel destroy her. Promise me." "Richard, I don't know if I can promise." His eyes were clearer now, more focused. "She's my daughter. Our daughter. Protect her." Then his eyes closed and he was gone again, back into the coma, the monitors continuing their steady beeping as if that moment of consciousness had never happened. Elaine sat there for a long time, holding her husband's hand, feeling the weight of his words settling over her. "Our daughter," he'd said. "Not my daughter. Our daughter." She left the hospital and drove directly to the family attorney's office. She retrieved documents she'd kept hidden for 8 years. She made phone calls to Harold Brennan, who agreed finally to tell the complete truth. She gathered evidence that would corroborate my claims and destroy Daniel's case. And then, on a Tuesday night in late August, 3 weeks before the trial, she appeared at my apartment. I'd been working late with Catherine reviewing my testimony for what felt like the 100th time when the doorman called up. "Ms. Hart, there's an Elaine Powell here to see you. Should I send her up?" I looked at Catherine, who raised her eyebrows. "Your call." "Send her up." Elaine appeared at my door 2 minutes later, and I barely recognised her. She'd lost weight, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. And her eyes were swollen and red, like she'd been crying for hours. "I can't let this continue," she said without preamble. "I can't let Daniel do this to you. I need to tell you everything." I stood in my doorway, looking at this woman who'd made my childhood miserable, who'd hidden my inheritance, who'd spent 30 years resenting my existence, and I didn't know what to feel. Anger, yes, but also something unexpected pity. "Come in," I said, finally stepping aside. Elaine entered slowly, looking around my penthouse like she'd never seen a home before. Catherine gathered her papers, giving me a questioning look. I nodded yes, she could stay. Whatever Elaine had come to say, I wanted a witness. "Would you like some water?" "Coffee?" I asked, falling back on the automatic politeness I'd learned in the Powell household. "Water, please." Elaine's voice was hoarse. I poured 3 glasses of water and we sat in my living room, the space that had become my war room over the past 3 months. Elaine's eyes travelled over the evidence boards, the stacks of documents, the timeline charts covering my walls. "You've been preparing," she said quietly. "I've been fighting for my life, my reputation, everything I've built." I sat across from her, keeping the coffee table between us like a barrier. "You said you can't let this continue. What did you mean?" Elaine took a long drink of water, her hands trembling slightly around the glass. "Daniel came to see me last week. He wanted me to testify at the trial to support his claim that you forged the documents. He had a whole script prepared, things he wanted me to say, about how you'd always been troubled, how you'd manipulated Richard in his final years. And you agreed. I told him I needed time to think about it. That's when he..." Her voice broke. "That's when he told me what would happen if I didn't cooperate. He said he'd have me declared mentally incompetent, that he'd commit me to a care facility, take control of my assets, make sure I never saw the outside world again. He said it so calmly, like he was discussing a business transaction." Catherine leaned forward. "He threatened you. He promised me." "There's a difference." Elaine set down her glass. "My own son looked at me and told me I was only useful as long as I did what he wanted. And if I didn't, I was just another problem to be managed." I watched her face, trying to determine if this was genuine or another manipulation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Richard woke up. just for a few minutes, but he woke up. Elaine's eyes filled with tears. And the only thing he cared about, the only thing he asked for was you. He told me to protect you. He called you our daughter, not his daughter, ours. And I realized I've spent 30 years punishing you for my husband's betrayal, and the only person I've really destroyed is myself. The silence stretched between us. Catherine looked at me, clearly wondering if we could trust this, if it was real or just another layer of Powell family dysfunction. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. "Nothing. I want to give you something." Elaine reached into her purse and pulled out a legal envelope sealed with the Powell family attorney's stamp. "This is the original will. The real one, not the copy that was filed with the courts. Richard kept it in his private safe at the house, the one only he and I knew about. I've been hiding it for 10 years, ever since I first found out about the Hope 19 Foundation." Catherine took the envelope, examined the seal, then carefully opened it. She read through the document, her eyes widening. This matches exactly what Harold Brennan described. Same language, same percentages, same stipulations. This is the proof we needed that the sealed trust was real. There's more. Elaine pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound and worn. This was Richard's personal journal. He kept it in the same safe. He wrote about Elena, about you, about his regrets. It's all there, his affair, the pregnancy, the decision to hide you in foster care, until enough time had passed. Every lie we told, every choice we made, he documented it. I took the journal from her, feeling the weight of my father's words before I even opened it. Why now? Why wait until 3 weeks before the trial? Because I'm a coward. Elaine's voice was flat honest in its self-assessment. Because it took Daniel threatening me to make me realise what I'd become. Because Richard had to literally wake up from a coma and beg me to do the right thing. Because I spent 3 months alone in that house looking at photographs of you as a child and finally understanding what I'd done. She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I can't let Daniel destroy you with lies when I have the truths sitting in a safe. I can't be that person anymore. Catherine spoke carefully. "Mrs. Powell, are you willing to testify? To go on record about all of this? The hidden will, the journal, Daniel's threats, everything. Yes, I'll testify. I'll tell the court exactly what happened, what we did, how we treated her." Elaine turned back to me. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this to make amends. Nothing I do can make amends for 30 years of cruelty. I'm doing this because it's the truth, and the truth should have been told decades ago." I sat there holding my father's journal, looking at this broken woman who'd shaped so much of my pain, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, I wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But maybe understanding, maybe the recognition that hurt people, and Elaine had been hurt long before I'd ever entered her life. "I can't promise forgiveness," I said slowly. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I can let you do the right thing. I can let you testify to the truth." Elaine nodded, tears flowing freely now. "That's more than I deserve." "You're right, it is." I stood up, still holding the journal. "Catherine will need to prepare you for testimony. The trial is in 3 weeks. Daniel's attorneys will try to destroy your credibility, especially after you've been supporting him up until now. They'll call you a traitor, say you're being coerced or manipulated. It won't be easy." "I know." Elaine stood as well, looking smaller, somehow diminished. "But for the first time in 30 years, I'll be telling the truth. That has to count for something." Catherine walked Elaine to the door, exchanging information about when they'd meet to prepare her testimony. I stayed in the living room, opening the journal to a random page. My father's handwriting, small and precise, filled the lined paper. Today, Christina graduated summa cum laude from Columbia, one entry read. I watched from the back of the auditorium because Elaine refused to attend. She was brilliant on that stage, everything Elena would have been proud of. I'm a coward for not telling her the truth. Every day I'm a coward. I closed the journal, unable to read more. Not yet. After Elaine left, Catherine returned to the living room. Well, that changes everything. Does it change enough? With her testimony, the original will and Richard's journal corroborating everything, combined with our forensic evidence that Daniel forged documents. Catherine smiled for the first time in weeks. We don't just have a case anymore. We have a prosecution. At my door, before she left, Elaine had turned back one more time. I don't deserve forgiveness, she'd said again, her voice barely above a whisper. But please, let me make this right. Those 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, and suddenly it was September 20th. The day that would determine whether I was a fraud or a victim, whether I'd reclaim my identity or lose everything I'd fought for. I dressed carefully that morning, a charcoal grey suit, professional but not aggressive, my hair pulled back in a simple style. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw my mother's eyes looking back. Eleanor, who died bringing me into this world, who'd never known what would become of her daughter. The courthouse was packed. News vans lined the street outside reporters with cameras jostling for position on the steps. Inside, the gallery was filled to capacity, journalists, financial analysts, curious spectators drawn by months of scandal. I walked down the centre aisle with Catherine beside me and Michael one step behind, feeling every eye on me, hearing the whispers that followed in my wake. Daniel was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his legal team from Whitmore and Associates. He looked confident, almost smug, in an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he smiled, a small, cold smile that said he believed he'd already won. Judge Margaret Rodriguez entered, and we all rose. She was in her late 50s, known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. That reputation would serve us well today. Daniel's attorneys went first as the plaintiff had the burden of proof in a civil case. They spent the morning presenting their case with slick precision. They showed the supposedly authentic emails where I'd allegedly threatened Richard, pressured him, manipulated him into creating the Hope 19 Foundation. They called witnesses a former Powell Industries employee who claimed I'd always been resentful, a financial analyst who testified that the trust documents seemed irregularly structured, a handwriting expert who claimed the signatures on some documents appeared inconsistent. It was all very convincing if you didn't know it was built on lies. Daniel himself took the stand just before lunch. He played his part beautifully, the concerned son trying to protect his father's legacy from a manipulative adopted sister. His voice cracked at all the right moments when talking about Richard's decline, his confusion in his final years, how I'd allegedly taken advantage of his vulnerability. My father loved Christina, Daniel said, looking directly at the jury. He wanted to provide for her, but 5% as stated in his legal will was what he deemed appropriate for an adopted daughter. This claim of 20%, this supposed secret trust, it's a fabrication, a cruel attempt to take advantage of a dying man who can no longer defend himself. I sat perfectly still through all of it, my face neutral, showing nothing. Catherine had drilled this into me, let them perform, let them present their fiction, but don't react. The jury was watching me as much as they were watching the witnesses. They needed to see someone calm, someone confident in the truth, not someone emotional or defensive. After lunch, it was our turn. Catherine started with Dr. Sarah Chen and the digital forensics team. They methodically dismantled every piece of Daniel's electronic evidence. They showed the jury the IP address data proving the emails had been created at Daniel's law firm. They presented the metadata analysis revealing the forgery. They explained in clear, simple terms how the fake interview video had been constructed using AI technology. I watched the jury's faces change as they absorbed this information. Confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to anger. They had been lied to, and juries don't like being lied to. Then Catherine called Harold Brennan to the stand. The old attorney walked slowly to the witness box, looking every one of his 83 years. But his voice was steady as he testified about creating the Hope 19 Foundation at Richard's instruction, about the sealed trust, about Elaine's threats that had kept him silent for so long. Daniel's attorney tried to shake him on cross-examination, suggested he was senile or confused, but Harold held firm. "I've been practicing law for 58 years, he said with quiet dignity. "My memory of creating that trust is perfectly clear, as is my memory of being coerced into hiding it." Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for 3 weeks. "The defence calls Elaine Powell," Catherine announced. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Daniel's head snapped around his confident expression, cracking for the first time all day. He'd had no warning that his mother would testify, no opportunity to threaten or manipulate her into silence. Elaine walked to the witness stand with her head high. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, but there was something different in her bearing. Purpose, maybe. Or simply the relief of someone finally telling the truth after decades of lies. She was sworn in, sat down, and looked directly at me before Catherine even asked the first question. An acknowledgement, maybe even an apology. Catherine started gently establishing Elaine's identity and relationship to the parties involved. Then she got to the heart of it. "Mrs. Powell, did your husband Richard create a sealed trust called the Hope 19 Foundation?" "Yes, he did, 12 years ago." "And what did this trust contain?" $50 million and 20% of Powell Industries stock, all designated for Christina Hart, his biological daughter. The courtroom exploded. Judge Rodriguez had to bang her gavel 3 times to restore order. "And did you know about this trust, Miss Powell?" "Yes, I discovered it 8 years ago." "What did you do with that information?" Elaine took a breath. "I hid it. I coerced our family attorney into keeping it sealed indefinitely. I couldn't bear the thought of Christina receiving what she was legally entitled to, because every dollar she received felt like a victory for the woman my husband had loved more than me." Daniel was on his feet, his attorney trying to pull him back down. "She's lying. She's been turned against me." Judge Rodriguez glared at him. Mr. Powell, sit down, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Catherine continued unruffled. "Mrs. Powell, did your son Daniel know about the sealed trust?" "Yes, I told him about it 5 years ago, when Richard first started talking about revealing the truth to Christina. Daniel convinced me we had to keep it hidden, that it would destroy our family's legacy." "And did Daniel threaten you recently to ensure your cooperation in this lawsuit?" "Yes." Elaine's voice was steady now, matter-of-fact. "He told me he'd have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a facility if I didn't testify in his favour. He said I was only useful as long as I did what he wanted." Catherine presented the original will, Richard's journal phone records, showing Daniel's calls to various shell companies that had paid for the forged evidence. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating an undeniable picture of fraud and conspiracy. When it was over, when Daniel's attorney had tried and failed to discredit Elaine on cross-examination, Judge Rodriguez called a brief recess. We all knew what was coming. When she returned, her expression was grave. Having reviewed the evidence presented, including the forensic analysis of forged documents and the testimony of Miss Powell, this court finds that the plaintiff, Daniel Powell, has engaged in deliberate fraud and document forgery. The Hope Foundation documents are authentic and legally binding. Christina Hart is hereby recognised as the legal heir to the assets described therein. She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Powell, I'm also referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Powell out." 2 uniformed officers approached Daniel's table. The courtroom was dead silent as they put him in handcuffs. Daniel didn't struggle, didn't shout. He just turned and looked at me one last time as they led him toward the side door. In his eyes, I saw hatred and regret tangled together, a man finally facing consequences he'd spent his entire privileged life avoiding. Then, he was gone and it was over. 1 month after the trial, I sat in my penthouse looking out at the city I'd once viewed as my fortress against the Powell family, and realised I didn't need fortresses anymore. I'd won not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. The narrative had shifted completely. I was no longer the vengeful adopted daughter or the manipulative fraud. I was the victim who'd fought back the daughter, who'd reclaimed her identity, the woman who'd stood up to powerful people who'd tried to erase her. Sterling's board had reinstated me immediately after the verdict with profuse apologies and assurances that they'd never doubted me. I'd accepted their apologies with the same cool professionalism they'd shown when they'd suspended me, making it clear that I remembered their lack of support even if I was willing to move past it. But the real question had been what to do with the $50 million. That kind of money could change everything, or it could change nothing, depending on how you used it. I thought about Elena, about the woman who'd loved my father and died bringing me into the world. I thought about 6-year-old me in foster care waiting to be claimed. I thought about all the children who were still waiting, still hoping someone would see them as worth loving. The decision came easily after that. I held a press conference, my second major one, announcing that I was donating $30 million to establish the Elena Reyes Foundation for Foster Children and Orphanages. The foundation would provide educational scholarships, mental health services, and support systems for children aging out of the foster care system. It would ensure that other children wouldn't have to grow up feeling as unwanted and invisible as I had. The announcement made front pages across the country. The photograph they used most frequently showed me smiling, genuinely smiling, surrounded by children from a local foster care agency at the foundation's launch event. I was kneeling down to their level, listening to a little girl tell me about wanting to be a doctor someday, and the photographer had caught that moment of connection. I looked happy in that photo, really happy in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe in my entire life. What I couldn't know at the time, was that Daniel saw that photograph, saw it while sitting in his holding cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Centre, waiting for his formal sentencing hearing. I learned about this later through his attorney, who contacted me with information I never asked for, but perhaps needed to hear anyway. Daniel's fall had been swift and absolute. After the trial, the SEC had accelerated their investigation into his money laundering schemes. With the attention from his criminal trial prosecutors, had built an airtight case. He was facing multiple federal charges, fraud, money laundering conspiracy, and now document forgery from the civil trial. His attorneys were negotiating a plea deal, but even with cooperation, he was looking at 5 to 7 years in federal prison. Powell Industries had filed for bankruptcy protection. The company Richard had spent 40 years building was being dismantled, sold off piece by piece to satisfy creditors and legal judgments. The family estate in Greenwich was on the market. The life of wealth and privilege Daniel had always taken for granted had evaporated in less than 6 months. But perhaps worse than the loss of wealth was the loss of his social circle. The friends who'd laughed at his serial joke at the wedding, who'd celebrated with him, who'd benefited from his family's connections, they'd all vanished. No one returned his calls. No one visited him in detention. The society that had embraced him when he was a wealthy heir had no use for him as a disgraced criminal. His attorney told me that Daniel spent his days in a small cell sharing space with 3 other inmates awaiting trial. He had no special privileges, no comfortable accommodations. He was just another defendant in an orange jumpsuit, learning what it felt like to be invisible, to be treated as less than to have all your power stripped away. One morning, about 3 weeks after the trial, Daniel's cellmate had been reading the newspaper when he'd spotted the article about my foundation, the photograph of me with the foster children. The headline, Christina Hart channels pain into purpose, £30 donation to help orphaned children. According to his attorney, Daniel had asked to see the paper. He'd sat on his bunk for hours, staring at that photograph, reading and rereading the article about how I was using the money I'd fought for to help others rather than simply enriching myself. After that, he'd written me a letter. It arrived at my apartment 2 days later, delivered by his attorney, who looked uncomfortable handing it over. Mr. Powell asked me to deliver this to you personally. You're under no obligation to read it or respond. I held the envelope for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Part of me wanted to burn it unopened to deny him even the satisfaction of knowing whether I'd read his words. But curiosity won out. I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on legal pad paper. His handwriting, usually so confident and bold, looked shaky, uncertain. It started with Christina, not Dear Christina, just my name, like he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to any pleasantries. He wrote about regret, about how he'd spent his entire life taking things for granted, his wealth, his status, his family's love, about how he'd treated me as less than human, because it had been easy, because no one had ever told him it was wrong, because cruelty had cost him nothing. I see it now, he wrote. I see how every joke, every dismissal, every moment of making you feel small was a choice I made. I told myself you were too sensitive, that you couldn't take a joke, that you should be grateful for what we gave you. I never once considered that what we gave you wasn't enough, that you deserved love, not charity, that you deserved to belong, not to be tolerated. He wrote about the wedding, about the cereal, about thinking it would be funny to remind me of my place, about how he'd genuinely believed I'd overreacted by cancelling the business deal, that I was being petty and vindictive. I didn't understand that it wasn't about the cereal, he wrote. It was about 30 years of cereal, 30 years of being treated as less. I do understand now, but understanding came too late to matter. The letter ended with an apology that felt both sincere and hollow at the same time. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for who I was. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo the damage, doesn't give you back the childhood you deserved. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I finally see what I couldn't see before. You were always better than all of us. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it back in the envelope. I resealed it with tape and returned it to his attorney unopened, as far as anyone else would know. Please tell Mr. Powell that I don't need his apology, I said. What I needed was the truth, and I got that in court. His regret is his to carry, not mine to absolve. The attorney nodded understanding. He thought you might say that. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my window, looking out at the city lights. I thought about forgiveness, about whether I'd ever be able to give it, whether I even wanted to. Michael had said something to me once during one of our careful conversations. As we rebuilt trust, forgiveness isn't about making them feel better. It's about freeing yourself from carrying their burden. Maybe someday I'd forgive Daniel. Maybe someday I'd forgive Elaine Richard, all of them. But not today. Today, I was content to let them live with their regrets, while I lived with my freedom. Daniel's attorney told me one more thing before he left, something that Daniel had apparently mentioned during their last meeting. In his cell, Daniel kept one photograph, an old family picture from when I was maybe 10 years old, Christmas morning at the Powell house. It was one of those professional photos Elaine had insisted on. Every year, everyone dressed in coordinated outfits, posed in front of the enormous tree. Daniel told his attorney he looked at that photo differently now. For the first time, he noticed where I was standing, not in the centre with the family, but at the very edge of the frame, slightly apart, slightly out of focus, almost cropped out entirely. I never saw it before, Daniel had said. In every photo, every memory, she was always at the edge. And I never once thought to ask why or to move over and make room for her. Now he had nothing but time to think about it, to see all the things he'd refused to see before. And unlike me, he couldn't walk away from those memories. He had to sit with them day after day in a cell that was smaller than my childhood bedroom had been. That I thought was justice. That sense of justice, that feeling of rightness in the world was still new to me 2 weeks after the trial, when Elaine called and asked if I would come to dinner. "Just the two of us," she said over the phone, her voice uncertain. "At the house. I know it's a lot to ask after everything, but I'd like to talk. Really talk, not in a courtroom or with lawyers present. Just you and me." I almost said no. The wound was still too fresh, the years of hurt still too raw. But something in her voice, a vulnerability I'd never heard before, made me hesitate. "When?" I asked. "Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. I agreed before I could talk myself out of it. Saturday evening I drove to Greenwich for what I knew would be one of the last times. The estate was already showing signs of neglect, the gardens not quite as manicured. Some of the exterior lights burned out and not replaced. The house that had once represented impossible perfection was revealing itself to be just a structure aging and impermanent like everything else. I rang the doorbell and waited, half expecting a housekeeper to answer, as always. Instead, Elaine opened the door herself. She looked different. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, no jewellery, except her wedding ring. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail and she wore no makeup. I'd never seen her like this, so ordinary, so stripped of the armour of wealth and social status she'd always worn. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would." I wasn't sure either. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. No staff moving through hallways, no caterers preparing elaborate meals, no background hum of people maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection. Just silence and empty rooms. "I let the staff go," Elaine said, as if reading my thoughts. "After the trial, after everything came out, I realised I didn't want to keep pretending. I didn't want people cleaning up after me, cooking for me, making my life comfortable while I sat and did nothing of value. Does that make sense?" "It does, actually." She led me to the kitchen, the actual kitchen, not the formal dining room where we'd eaten countless uncomfortable meals over the years. This was the space where staff had prepared our food, where I'd sometimes hidden as a child, feeling safer among the people who worked for the Powells than among the family itself. The kitchen table was set simply 2 plates, 2 wine glasses, cloth napkins that looked like they had been ironed by unpracticed hands. Something was cooking on the stove and I smelled garlic and herbs. "I made chicken piccata," Elaine said, moving to the stove with visible nervousness. "Or I attempted to. I found the recipe online. I've never actually cooked a meal before, not a real one. The staff always..." She stopped, shook her head. "I'm rambling. I'm nervous." "You're nervous?" "Terrified, actually." She turned to look at me. "I'm about to have dinner with the daughter I failed for 34 years, and I have no idea how to be a mother. I never learned. I never tried." I sat down at the table, unsure what to say to that level of honesty. Elaine brought the food over. The chicken looked good, actually. Golden and garnished with lemon and capers. She'd made rice and green beans too. It was simple, probably imperfect, but it was made with her own hands. That mattered somehow. She poured wine, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, making the bottle clink against the glass. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The food was good, a little overcooked, maybe the rice slightly mushy, but infinitely better than the elaborate meals we'd shared in the formal dining room where no one had ever asked how my day was or what I was thinking. "I need to say something." Elaine began setting down her fork. "And I need you to listen without interrupting, because if I stop, I might lose the courage to continue." I nodded. "I was 28 when I married Richard. I came from money, old Connecticut money, and I was raised to marry well and maintain the family standing. Richard was perfect on paper, ambitious, successful, from a good family. We had a nice wedding, a nice honeymoon, and then we came home and started trying to have children because that's what people like us did. She took a sip of wine, her eyes distant. 3 miscarriages in 4 years. Each one broke me a little more. The doctors couldn't explain it. There was no medical reason I couldn't carry a child to term. It just kept happening. And each time I felt more like a failure. Like I had one job, one purpose, and I couldn't do it. Richard was understanding at first, then distant, then absent. He threw himself into work, and I threw myself into charity events and social causes, both of us pretending we had a real marriage. Then Eleanor happened, I said quietly. Then Eleanor happened. Elaine's voice cracked. And she got pregnant so easily. She was younger, yes, but it felt like the universe was mocking me. This woman, who'd been with my husband for one night, got the one thing I'd wanted desperately for years. And when Richard told me about it, when he said he was considering leaving me for her, I wanted to die. Or I wanted her to die. I wasn't sure which. I set down my own fork, watching her face, seeing decades of pain etched in lines I'd never noticed before. When Elena died in childbirth, I felt relief. God help me, I felt relieved that she was gone, that Richard would stay with me, that we could pretend it never happened. And then, Richard said he wanted to bring you home right away, and I convinced him that would cause a scandal. I told him we'd do it eventually, when enough time had passed. And every year, I found another reason to delay, another excuse to keep you in foster care. 6 years, I said. I was in foster care for 6 years. 6 years. Elaine's tears were falling now. 6 years, I kept my husband's daughter in the system because I was punishing him, punishing Elena through you. When we finally brought you home, I told myself I'd try to be a good mother. But every time I looked at you every single day, I saw her. I saw the woman Richard had loved enough to risk everything for. And I saw his betrayal and my failure and everything wrong with my marriage reflected in your face. So you made sure I knew I didn't belong. Yes, I made sure you knew, because if you knew, then you couldn't hurt me more than you already had by existing. She looked directly at me, her face wet with tears. I was afraid to love you, Christina, because loving you meant accepting Richard's betrayal. It meant accepting that he'd loved someone else more than me. It meant acknowledging that you were his daughter in a way that was real and biological and undeniable, and I couldn't bear that. So I chose cruelty instead. I chose to make you suffer for my pain. The kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I felt tears on my own face, but made no move to wipe them away. I can't give you back your childhood, Elaine continued. I can't undo the damage I did. But I can tell you the truth, which is that you deserved better. You deserved a mother who could see past her own hurt and love you for who you were. You deserved to grow up knowing you were wanted, cherished, celebrated. And I stole that from you because I was too broken to be what you needed. I sat there processing decades of pain through the lens of her confession. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the years of feeling unwanted and invisible. But it gave me something I'd never had before: context. Understanding, the knowledge that her cruelty had never been about my worth, but about her wounds. I forgive you, I said finally, and watched her face crumple with relief and grief. But I need you to understand something. I forgive you, but I can't go back to being your daughter. That chance passed a long time ago. We can't recreate what we never had. I know, Elaine whispered. I know that. Maybe we can be something else. Something new. 2 women who are connected by complicated history and are trying to figure out what comes next. But not mother and daughter. I don't think we can be that. Elaine nodded, wiping her eyes with her napkin. That's more than I deserve. We finished dinner in a different kind of silence. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile either. Something tentative and fragile, the first steps towards something neither of us could name yet. As I was leaving, standing at the front door with my coat on, Elaine touched my arm gently. Would you... she started, then stopped, gathering courage. Then, will you have breakfast with me tomorrow? I said yes. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because after 34 years of rejection, someone asking me to stay for breakfast felt like something I needed to experience. Maybe because I wanted to see if this fragile thing we'd started to build over dinner could survive the light of morning. Maybe because some part of me, the part that was still 6 years old and desperate to belong, needed to know what it felt like to be invited. I drove back to Greenwich the next morning, Sunday, arriving at 9 o'clock as Elaine had suggested. The October air was crisp leaves turning gold and red on the trees that lined the driveway. The estate looked different in morning light, less imposing, more like what it actually was, just a house, beautiful but aging, where people had lived and made mistakes and hurt each other. Elaine answered the door in the same casual clothes as the night before, her hair still in that simple ponytail. She looked like she'd slept poorly, dark circles under her eyes, but there was something softer in her expression when she saw me. "You came," she said, and I heard genuine surprise in her voice, as if she'd spent the night convinced I'd changed my mind. I said I would. Yes, but I wasn't sure. She stopped herself. "Come in. I've made coffee, or tried to. I'm still learning how to use that machine." I followed her into the kitchen, the same space where we'd eaten dinner, and that's when I saw them. 2 bowls on the table, 2 spoons, 2 small cartons of milk, and a box of cereal, the same generic cornflakes that had been placed in front of me at Daniel's wedding 5 months ago. I stopped in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. Elaine stood by the table, her hands trembling visibly, her eyes meeting mine with something that looked like fear, or maybe hope, or possibly both tangled together. "I needed to do this," she said quietly. "I needed to acknowledge what happened, what I allowed to happen. The cereal at the wedding, I saw Daniel do it. I heard him say those words and I did nothing. I laughed. I was complicit in that humiliation, in making you feel like you were worth less than everyone else in that room." Her voice was shaking now. "So I thought maybe we could start over. Maybe we could have breakfast together, really together, and I could try to make it mean something different." I looked at those bowls of cereal sitting on the table, and I felt the weight of everything they represented. Every morning I'd eaten alone as a child while the Powell family had elaborate breakfasts together. Every time I'd been made to feel like I should be grateful for the bare minimum. Every moment I'd been reminded that I was an obligation, not a choice. But I also saw what Elaine was trying to do, however clumsily. She was trying to face the symbol of her cruelty head-on to transform it into something else. She was offering me cereal because that's what had been offered to me before, but this time she was offering it with consciousness, with remorse, with the acknowledgement that it had never been enough. I looked at her standing there, this woman who'd made my childhood miserable, and I made a decision. "No," I said gently. Elaine's face fell. "I understand. I shouldn't have presumed. No, I mean, we're not eating cereal." I walked past her to the refrigerator, opened it, and started pulling out ingredients. "Do you have flour, baking powder?" Yes, in the pantry." "What are you doing?" "Making pancakes." I found what I needed, brought everything to the counter. "When I was in foster care before you and Richard brought me home, there was this woman, Mrs. Chen. She ran the group home where I stayed for the last 2 years. Every Sunday, she made pancakes for all of us kids. She'd let us help, let us crack the eggs and measure the flour. It was the only time I remember feeling like I was part of something, like I mattered." I started mixing ingredients, my hands moving from muscle memory. "I haven't made pancakes in years, but I think that's what we should have for breakfast. Not cereal, not something that represents being less than, something that represents choosing to make something better." Elaine stood watching me, tears streaming silently down her face. Then slowly she moved to stand beside me. "Can I help?" I handed her the whisk. "Mix this while I heat the pan." We worked together in silence for a few minutes. She whisked the batter while I melted butter in the pan, the smell filling the kitchen with something warm and comforting. When the first pancake hit the hot surface, it sizzled and bubbled, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. "Mrs. Chen used to say that pancakes were about transformation," I said, flipping the first one. You take basic ingredients that aren't much on their own flour, eggs, milk, and you transform them into something better. She said people were like that too. We could take the basic ingredients of who we were and choose to become something better. She sounds like a wise woman, Elaine said quietly. She was. She died when I was 16. I went to the funeral, but Richard and you didn't come with me. You said it would be inappropriate that she was just a foster care worker I'd known briefly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. We made a stack of pancakes together, working side by side in the kitchen that had once been the domain of staff who'd been more family to me than the actual family upstairs. When we finally sat down to eat, Elaine had found maple syrup and honey, and we drizzled both over our plates. The first bite was warm and sweet and perfect. Not because the pancakes were flawless, they weren't. They were a little uneven, some darker than others, but because they represented something we'd chosen to create together, rather than something that had been assigned to me as my designated worth. We ate mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than dinner had been. This was companionable, tentative, but real. Every so often, one of us would comment on something small, the weather, the coffee being stronger than expected, whether we should have added blueberries. Ordinary things, the kind of things mothers and daughters might say to each other over breakfast if they had an ordinary relationship. But we didn't have an ordinary relationship and never would. What we had was something harder to define. Two people connected by blood and trauma and the complicated legacy of choices made decades ago, trying to figure out if they could build something new from the ruins of what should have been. When we finished eating, when our plates were empty and the coffee pot drained, Elaine stood and retrieved something from the counter. A cream-coloured envelope, the paper aged and slightly yellowed at the edges. I want to give you something, she said, sitting back down and placing the envelope between us. This is a letter I wrote 20 years ago, right after we brought you home from foster care. You were 6 years old, so small and frightened, and for a brief moment that first night, I felt something shift in me. I felt like maybe I could do... This could be your mother could love you the way you deserved. She pushed the envelope toward me with one finger, like it might burn her to touch it too long. I wrote down everything I was feeling that night, the hope, the fear, the desire to try. I sealed it and told myself I'd give it to you someday, when you were older, when you'd understand. But as the years went by and I failed you over and over again, I couldn't bring myself to give you a letter full of promises I'd broken. So I kept it hidden, and eventually I almost forgot about it. She looked up at me. I found it last week, going through old papers, and I think you should have it. Not because it excuses anything or changes anything, but because you deserve to know that once, even if just for a moment, I tried to be what you needed. I looked at the envelope at my name written in Elaine's careful handwriting from 2 decades ago. Part of me wanted to tear it open right then, to read the words of a woman who'd briefly wanted to love me before choosing not to. But another part knew I wasn't ready. That letter represented a version of our story that had never come true, a path not taken, and I needed to be in the right place emotionally to absorb what might have been. Thank you, I said, picking up the envelope and holding it carefully. But I'm not going to read it right now. I need to save it for when I'm ready. Elaine nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course. It's yours. You can do whatever you want with it. Read it, burn it, keep it sealed forever. Just know that it exists, that there was a moment when I saw you as a daughter, even if I couldn't sustain that vision. I stood to leave the envelope in my hand, feeling heavier than paper should feel. At the door, Elaine walked me out to my car, and for a moment we stood awkwardly, not sure how to say goodbye. Thank you for breakfast, she said finally. For the pancakes, for trying. Thank you for asking me to stay, I replied. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw Elaine standing in the doorway of that big, empty house watching me leave. But this time, I wasn't running away. I was simply going home, knowing I could come back if I chose to. The envelope sat on my passenger seat, unopened, but present a promise from the past, waiting for a future moment when I'd be strong enough to hear it. I drove back to Manhattan with the envelope on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few minutes as if it might disappear or transform into something else. Traffic was light on a Sunday evening, and I made it home in 40 minutes, parking in my building's garage and carrying that cream-coloured envelope like it was made of glass. In my penthouse, I set it on the kitchen counter and tried to ignore it. I made tea. I checked my emails. I stood at my window looking out at the city lights, the same view I'd looked at 1,000 times before, but everything felt different now. I was different now. The woman who'd walked into Daniel's wedding 5 months ago had been someone still seeking approval, still hoping to be seen as worthy by people who'd decided long ago she wasn't. The woman standing at this window now knew her worth, had fought for it, had claimed it in a courtroom and in the world. But that envelope on the counter represented something else. Not my worth, which I'd already established, but the question of what might have been if different choices had been made by people other than me. I picked it up around 8 o'clock when the city was fully dark and my apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic below. I sat on my couch, turned on the lamp beside me, and carefully opened the envelope that had been sealed for 20 years. The first thing I pulled out wasn't a letter at all. It was a document, legal and official, with the state of Connecticut seal embossed at the top. Adoption papers. The original adoption papers from when I was 6 years old, signed by Richard Powell and Elaine Powell, making me legally their daughter. I'd seen copies of these before, had needed them for various legal purposes over the years. But these were the originals, the actual documents that had been filed with the court with signatures in fresh ink from 1996. At the bottom, in the space designated for the adoptive parents to write a statement, if they wished, Richard had written, "We welcome Christina into our family with open hearts and the promise to provide her with love and opportunity." I traced those words with my finger, open hearts and love promises that had been broken almost immediately. But beneath the adoption papers was something else. A handwritten letter on powder blue stationery, 3 pages folded together. I recognised Elaine's handwriting, though it looked younger, somehow less controlled, more emotional. The date at the top read November 19th, 1996, the day they'd brought me home. I began to read. "Dear Christina," the letter started, "you're sleeping in your new room right now in the bed we bought for you with the white comforter you picked out at the store. You were so shy picking it out, asking permission 3 times if it was really okay to choose that one. Your social worker told us you've been in 4 different foster homes in 6 years, and my heart breaks thinking about what that must have been like for you. A child should never have to ask permission to exist, to take up space, to want things." I felt tears starting already, but I kept reading. I need to be honest with myself, which is why I'm writing this down where no one else will see it. I'm terrified. Terrified of being your mother. Terrified of failing you. Terrified of what it means that you're Richard's daughter with another woman. When we picked you up today, when I saw you for the first time in person, I saw Eleanor in your face. The same eyes, the same serious expression, and I felt anger rise up in me so fast it scared me. The honesty was brutal, but I appreciated it more than I would have appreciated comfortable lies. But then something happened. We brought you home, showed you your room, and you stood in the doorway like you were afraid to enter. Richard told you it was your room, that you could go in, and you actually asked for how long, like you expected us to take it away from you at any moment. And something in me cracked open. I picked you up, which surprised both of us, and I carried you into that room. You were so small, so light, and you wrapped your arms around my neck and held on like you were drowning. I remembered that moment. I remembered being carried across that threshold, remembered the feeling of someone's arms around me for the first time in years, remembered thinking maybe this place would be different. I told you, this is your room, forever. You're home now, you're ours. And you looked at me with those big eyes and asked, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." And in that moment, Christina, I meant it. I felt it. I wanted to be your mother. I wanted to love you and protect you and give you everything you'd been denied. I wanted to erase all the hurt you'd experienced and replace it with security and warmth and belonging. She'd written a few more paragraphs about that first evening, helping me unpack my small bag of belongings, reading me a bedtime story, watching me fall asleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit I'd brought from the group home. She described feeling hopeful, feeling like maybe she could do this, like maybe loving me could help heal the wound Eleanor's existence had created in her marriage. But I'm also afraid, the letter continued, I'm afraid that every time I look at you, I'll see her. I'm afraid that Richard loves you because you're part of her, and that I'll never be enough for either of you. I'm afraid that I'm not strong enough to love another woman's child, especially when that woman is the one my husband loved enough to risk everything for. I'm writing this tonight while I feel brave and hopeful, while I still believe I can be what you need. I want to remember this feeling because I have a terrible suspicion that by tomorrow, or next week, or next month, I'll have let fear win. And if that happens, if I fail you, I want there to be a record that once, even if just for one night, I saw you as my daughter and wanted to love you as mothers should love their children. The letter ended there with no signature, as if she'd known, even as she wrote it, that she wouldn't be able to sustain the person she was in those words. My hands were shaking as I set down the letter. There was one more item in the envelope, a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed Elaine sitting in the rocking chair that used to be in what became my bedroom, holding 6-year-old me in her lap. I was wearing pink pajamas, clutching my rabbit, and I was looking up at her with an expression of tentative hope. And Elaine was smiling down at me, not the tight social smile I'd become familiar with, but a real smile, warm and genuine and full of something that looked remarkably like love. Someone had taken this photo, probably Richard, on that first night, and then it had been hidden away, just like the letter evidence of a version of our story that had lasted less than 24 hours before fear and resentment had taken over. I looked at that photograph for a long time at 6-year-old me, who'd had no idea how thoroughly she was about to be disappointed at Elaine, who'd felt love and chosen fear instead. And I cried, but not the way I'd cried over the years when thinking about my childhood. This wasn't the bitter, angry crying of someone who'd been rejected. This was something softer, sadder, more complicated. I cried because there had been a moment when it could have been different. A moment when Elaine had wanted to be my mother when I'd been held and told I was home when love had been possible. And I cried because that moment had been real, even if it hadn't lasted, and knowing it had existed somehow made the loss of it more painful and more meaningful at the same time. But I also cried because I felt something I'd never felt before. I felt loved. Not in the present, not in any way that could heal the past, but loved nonetheless. For one night, I'd had a mother who'd wanted me. For one night, I'd been someone's daughter, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And even though she'd failed to sustain that love, even though fear had won the fact that it had existed at all mattered. I didn't forgive Elaine. I wasn't sure I ever fully would. But I understood her better, now understood that she'd tried and failed rather than never trying at all. And somehow, that understanding felt like its own kind of freedom. I placed the letter and the photograph by the window, where the morning light would find them. The sun had set hours ago, but I knew when morning came, when light streamed through that window, these artifacts of what might have been would be illuminated, not hidden anymore, not shameful or secret, just part of the complicated truth of who I was and where I'd come from. I sat by the window for a long time that night, holding that photograph of a mother and daughter who'd existed for one evening before fear had torn them apart, and I let myself cry for both of us, for the child I'd been, and the woman Elaine had failed to become. The tears were different this time. Not tears of pain, though pain was certainly there. These were tears of recognition, of finally having proof that once, even if only briefly, I'd been wanted, I'd been held, I'd been loved, and somehow knowing that made all the difference. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my coastal house, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic, and I finally understood what peace felt like. The house was small, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen overlooking the water, a fireplace I actually used. I'd found it in Rhode Island, far enough from New York to breathe close enough to return when needed. I called it mine in a way nothing else had ever been. I'd left Sterling Financial 3 months after the trial. Not in anger, but because building wealth for the already wealthy wasn't my purpose anymore. Instead, I'd started writing. The memoir was called The Woman Who Chose Her Breakfast, and it had just hit #1 on the bestseller list. People who needed to understand the title understood immediately. It wasn't about cereal. It was about choosing your own worth. Letters arrived daily from foster children, adopted adults, women who'd spent decades making themselves smaller. They said my story gave them permission to claim their worth, to stop seeking approval from people who'd never planned to give it. The Elena Reyes Foundation thrived with $30 million creating scholarships, therapy services, and mentor programs. My mother's name now helped ensure other children wouldn't grow up invisible as I had. I'd kept 20 million lived simply and discovered wealth meant little without knowing who you were. Richard had died 3 months ago, never waking. I attended his funeral, stood in the back, and felt acceptance, more than grief. He'd done what he could within his limitations. Elaine had moved to this same coastal town by coincidence. We had coffee, monthly, awkward, but genuine. Not mother and daughter, not quite friends, but 2 women connected by complicated history, both trying to become better. Daniel served 5 years in federal prison. I didn't visit or write. Some apologies aren't meant to be accepted. Michael had given me space, but never disappeared. Flowers arrived every few weeks, daisies and sunflowers with no cards. 3 months ago, he'd asked to visit. We'd walked to the beach for hours, and it felt easy. He'd visited 3 more times since. We were taking it slowly, letting something real grow naturally. This morning, I was making coffee when I heard a knock. 7 a.m., unexpected. Michael stood on my porch holding wildflowers, wearing jeans and a sweater, smiling in a way that made my heart hopeful. "Congratulations on #1, he said. "I brought flowers, but you might be tired of them." "Never," I said, taking them. "How did you know, checking obsessively since midnight?" He looked embarrassed. "I'm proud of you." "You have the right," I said, meaning it. We stood in the cool morning air, waves in the background. "I was about to make breakfast," I said. "Pancakes, mind if I join you for breakfast?" His smile widened, recognizing the question that represented invitation and new beginnings. I'd love that. I let him into this house and life I'd built. We moved into the kitchen. I pulled out ingredients. He started coffee. Natural, easy. As I mixed batter, I thought about that wedding, the cereal, the laughter, my choice to fight back. People called it revenge, vindictive, and overreaction. They were wrong. It hadn't been about destroying the Powells or the money. It had been simpler, more profound. I looked at Michael, pouring coffee, morning light streaming through windows, this life built by my own choices. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying them. It's about remembering your worth. If Christina's story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible or undervalued, if you've ever had to choose between seeking approval and claiming your worth, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what moment in this story hit you hardest. Was it the cereal scene at the wedding, the courtroom victory? Or maybe it was that quiet breakfast with Elaine where healing finally began. Your story matters just as much as Christina's, and this community is here to listen and support each other. And here's my question for you. If you were in Christina's position, would you have forgiven Elaine? Would you have read that letter right away or waited like Christina did? There's no right answer, but I'm genuinely curious about how you would have handled it differently. Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations help us all process our own complicated family relationships. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about people who refuse to let their past define their future. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them. And if you want to support the channel, give this video a like. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this community. Your presence matters. I'll see you in the next story.